looking at these as different knobs that we can turn based on the system itself, based on the cost, how we want to build it, and what our tolerance is for stability and longevity. So I wanted to just kind of think through, so as we are thinking about wood loading for the purpose of alluvial water storage, this is kind of the checklist of design questions that we're thinking through, and Allie and I are talking about, and we're trying to think about, like, how do we balance this project? So we're thinking about, first, the sediment budget. Is this a system that has enough natural sediment to regrade the system naturally? So downstream from a dam, for example, not a great candidate for doing this, right, if you want to regrade the channel. We're also thinking a lot about the porosity of the structures. Fundamentally, if we are going to regrade the channel, we need for those structures to be have low porosity. We want a slow flow right near the bed and trigger deposition. Fish passage, of course, is a concern, essentially building little wood dams in the stream. And so fish passage is a piece of the puzzle. Longitudinal design in terms of how different structures are working together is something that we're thinking a lot about. The stability, longevity, and risk related to infrastructure and project goals, and then, of course, the cost. And just to give you a preview of two of these pieces that we're going to illustrate with these examples, one is porosity of structures. So Allie's going to talk about our Poison Creek project, where it's hand-built, and our porosity really comes from these racking bundles that essentially we stuffed and stabilized at the bed and filled up all the nooks and crannies to make our structures at the lowest porosity we could from the very beginning. And then in our Eagle Creek project, which I'll talk about, it's a bigger system, and we actually changed our thinking a little bit on porosity with that, and really started thinking about using logs that are cut to fit in terms of horizontal members near the bed. Similar in some ways to the old Forest Service weirs, but rather than being a single log by itself, using that as a component of a more complex structure to be able to trigger deposition throughout the structure. And then one other quick example of design thinking is this longitudinal design idea. We're not putting in single structures to have a localized habitat benefit. We're really thinking at the reach scale, can we store sediment and store water? And so this has been something that we have learned quite a bit about through our pilot project, but we're now really thinking about how do we have a series of structures that essentially help us stair step up the stream. So if this is our structure, and this is kind of our backwater area where ultimately we expect for sediment to fill in and reduce local gradients, you know, how tightly do we need to space these such that they're all working together so we have a continuous effect over an area. And so getting the spacing down for each area has been a piece of the puzzle that we've been improving through time. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Allie to talk a little bit about Poison Creek, and then I'll finish things up with our Eagle Creek project.
Yeah, so we're going to go see this project in the field this afternoon, and Pete, who built these projects, he's going to be there, and he can answer more technical questions or even non-technical questions of just how does this all work. This week we've been doing our phase 2 of Poison, actually, which will be kind of exciting. So we've had WCC crews up there all week building new structures and doing structure maintenance. So we'll get to take a look at that and some of the new approaches that we've been utilizing under this phase 2. But this Poison project is really truly a pilot in the sense of it, Johan kind of talked a little bit about like lessons learned and starting small. So this is our starting small and learning from our lessons. What are we going to do differently? And it's a great watershed to work within because it is a small drainage. It's non-fish bearing, and the base flow is basically less than 1 CFS. So we're talking about a very, very small drainage. So how Pete kind of got clued into maybe this is a location where there might be concern about mass wasting or channel incision or all of these things that we're discussing is he was kind of clued into that in 2012, this in the upper drainage of Poison, some of the area was affected by fire. These two parcels are owned by Weyerhaeuser, and this lower parcel is owned by DNR. The DNR parcel is where we focused our work. In 2015, there was quite a bit of logging done in the upper watershed. And so we started to get concerned about what was going to happen downstream of that. And inevitably went out and started poking around to see what was happening. And we were finding pretty severe incisions throughout that entire lower reach. So it's about 8,500 feet of stream reach that we are looking at, but basically finding incision 4 to 5 feet and down to bedrock in some cases. So we thought this looked like a good, pilot location. So then we started talking to natural systems design. So we need to better understand the channel incision, our pre-project conditions. What are we looking at here? So at the very upper reach of the DNR parcel, there's actually some really nice reference wetlands here, and this is about 36% of the channel length. It looks really good up there. We've got multiple channels, and wetlands are engaged. Immediately downstream of that, we start to get into the incision pretty severely. So about 21% of the channel is moderately incised, 2 to 3 feet. 43% was severely incised, 4 to 5 feet of incision. So when we started to work on this project, as I already mentioned, this isn't fish bearing, so we don't have big dollars to work on the project. We needed to think stable, locally sourced wood. We needed to think about there's no roads up in here, so access. We needed to hand build these structures, and we wanted to be able to field fit everything and be able to adaptively manage it. So that was kind of the driving discussion in terms of the initial design approach. So we didn't go through full engineer plan sets for this. It seemed completely unnecessary. But what we wanted to do was get some typicals to reflect reoccurring site conditions. So we came up with, let's go back to that one, but we came up with these two, NSC came up with these two typicals to kind of convey to us what we're really trying to achieve when we build these structures. And as Susan mentioned, one of the initial key decision points was the inclusion of these wood bundles and really getting those down to the existing bed elevation. That was a really important key part of the design because we were concerned about toe scour. So we have these larger stability pieces of wood that we're putting up top to really encourage the hydraulic roughness and get the water out on the floodplain. But what was really key to the design was including to really fill the interstitial spaces and really tighten that up to encourage aggradation sooner. So I'll scroll back, but essentially the structure is about 30 to 40 feet in length each. We were limited to 10-inch wide tree DVH, and that was, non-merged timber for the DNR land that they were letting us use on site. We were able to utilize some trees that were at the specific structures that we wanted to use that were dead standing, that had a larger DVH than 10-inch. So we utilized a couple of those in place. And then each of the structures have about 20 logs set by hand and ballasted in place. And so essentially the design was pretty simple. We developed 21 structure sites. We'll kind of go through some pictures of this. So these wood bundles are really truly just collected on site using cottonwood and existing dogwood and willows, whips, and bundling these up. So one thing that we learned that we're utilizing on this round is we're actually wanting to really tighten up the porosity around these bundles even more. So we've now wrapped the bundles in a coir fabric. So we know that the fabric is going to decompose over time and become part of that if the longevity of that specific fabric is not meant to last. However, it helps to initially trigger that aggradation faster. So this is the picture that was on the very first slide, but this is structure forces immediately after construction in 2017. It's kind of hard to tell in the picture, but we've got like about 4 to 5 feet of incision down in here. This is a pretty incised site. You can't really tell all the bundles that are under there, but there's quite a bit of wood jammed down into the bed down in here. So it's not just these key pieces that are up top. There's a lot more going on underneath. This is 18 months post-construction. You can see that there is a lot of sediment moving out of that upper part of the watershed. It immediately has degraded, and the logs are buried several feet in some instances. We've got basically water spreading across the whole floodplain, and just this year, Pete started to notice like changes in the vegetation are happening pretty rapidly in this site.
Is this the same photo point as that?
Yeah, so I'll toggle a little bit so you can see. So this log that's buried in that last picture would be this one here.
Okay.
Yeah. So I will caution that because this is a pilot, we don't have as much monitoring data to share with you guys as we would like. It's something that we're putting a lot more effort into our second project with Eagle Creek. So we'll have to tell the story as much as possible, basically the pictures, and then once we're out in the field, you guys can really get a sense of how quickly this has started to grade and just how quickly it's working. So this is another kind of typical of what we're seeing is just new flow pathways kind of developing naturally, a lot of deposition, a lot of bars around the structures. So this one has even filled in more since then. This is 1 year post-construction. So this is prior to construction, we had, or right after construction, we had about a 3-foot channel depth. We've graded up to about a 1 foot. This has come up even more in the last year. So this is 2018, as I said.
Ali, did you mention the reason for the incision? Do you have some thoughts about, is it changing of hydrology due to the logging, or is it logging, or what?
I don't think I mentioned that. I think that it's like most of these systems, it's a multitude of land ownership issues. It's legacy of impact. And so I don't think we could pinpoint it necessarily on the logging or on the fire. I think it's a combination of effects.
Is it pretty well roaded above there?
Yeah, there's a lot of roads in a lot of the upper Mission drainage. So just kind of seeing more of the same, and I hope folks come out in the field because it's pretty remarkable to see in person, especially because there's still some sites where you can see the erosion, the incision prior to construction. We did install groundwater monitoring, transects, and we only got, a little bit of pre-project data. For our Eagle Creek project, we're going to have a full season of pre-project data. I think that's going to really help tell the story a lot better. What we ended up doing was transect, so basically moving further and further out onto the floodplain and trying to track changes in the groundwater elevation over time. I think it's still too early to tell really what's going on in this system. We also have upstream and downstream discharge stations, so there isn't a, saying Poison Creek, we're working on developing the rating curve and trying to understand this hydrograph. The base flow is less than a CFS, so basically it's like within the standard error of equipment to try and detect change. So it's really challenging in this site to be able to determine whether we are really impacting the base flow condition. So that's one trade-off of going with such a small site is we're not able to tease out the results as effectively as we would maybe in a larger system where we have a larger base flow that we can play with.
Are you measuring temperature upstream and downstream?
We are not measuring, or are we?
No, we do have
in the
loggers that we're using on that
right.
temperature.
Right. Haven't looked at that data clearly. So some lessons learned from this project that we're taking for future projects. Susan already mentioned the structure placement longitudinally has been really key. So I think we started out closer to like 80, 100 feet spacing distance, and we've tightened that up significantly. So we're looking at like 50 feet in between structure locations. That way they're really interacting together, and we're getting a more continuous reach benefit when we have tighter spacing in that way. It's also, you know, redundancy. In case of individual structure failure, the tighter they are, the less concern we would have about undermining the system. Again, I sort of talked about some of the lessons about bundles and porosity, but we are utilizing coir fabric now to try and wrap these smaller wood bundles. And in talking with Pete, he can talk more about this, but he's pretty amazed about how effective that is. And so he's trying a couple different methods on this phase 2 just to see how he could wrap the corner bundles and then wrap them within the larger logs as well, to just plug the interstitial spaces faster. And again, really important having the lower porosity right at that elevation to prevent scour. So that is a key part to our design. Utilizing on-site logs is awesome. It's not going to be possible in all sites, of course. This really decreased our cost in labor and materials, of course. Buying wood on this side of the mountain is expensive. Hauling it, trucking it, bringing it in, being able to utilize on-site materials is key. This is not going to be possible for systems where we have, you know, downstream infrastructure and we need to be considering larger pieces that have longer longevity, and we're concerned more about their blowout. So for Eagle Creek, we are importing in wood. We're not using on-site wood. And then we learned a lot about what we want to do for pre-project monitoring. Got some great ideas too from these folks, which was great. And I think part of the question is that some of the traditional monitoring techniques don't work really well in being able to characterize these changes. And one thing we want to include in the future is more information about the vegetation changes. We're already starting to see some of the pines are dying off. We're getting a lot of regrowth. We're getting cottonwood sprigs and willow sprigs and wetland vegetation coming up. And I think we want to do a better job of characterizing that. Susan's going to talk a little bit about transects for groundwater wells versus a diamond pattern and ways that helps better tell the story in a losing reach versus a gaining reach. And I already said vegetation.
Ellie, what was your total cost, including design?
So we were talking about this last night. I think we're at $1,000 a structure for this site.
The total cost?
Yeah.
How much was the total for how many sites?
So, well, we have 21 sites. So we wrote 21,000. We did have some additional money that in working with NSC on some of the larger effort that has been picked up from other sites, you know, in working on our modeling, that probably isn't reflected in that cost.
All right, I'll just talk about Eagle Creek here for just a couple minutes, mostly to contrast it with Poison Creek and some of our design thinking and how it's different. This is a project that's not in the ground yet. It'll be built next spring or summer, and it's in the greater Chumsick watershed. So just kind of for context, Eagle Creek is about 3 times larger than Poison Creek from a base flow, from a bankful flow perspective. So bigger peak, bigger bankful system. And this is a reach that is on private timber property, has a number, there's logging cables and such in the riparian corridor, so it's surrounded by a riparian forest of fairly small diameter wood. But we see lots of that small diameter wood in the stream, which provides some natural analogs for how wood functions in this system. This is just where we are. So this is Chumsick Creek flowing to the south. Eagle Creek is a major tributary, and we're working up in this area on private timberlands. We get out here, and then it's mostly in the Forest Service lands beyond there. So with this system, too, we have 2 culverts downstream, almost immediately downstream, which is part of the design criteria on this as it relates to site stability. So just want to kind of contrast this. So it's a bigger system. We have a higher infrastructure risk. And so what we tried to do is say, how can we take what we learned on Poison and adjust the design, and also think about how do we deal with the stability and risk issues here. And so as I mentioned before, one of the things that we're trialing in this pilot project is kind of a hybrid approach between the Forest Service Weir approach, the horizontal member, and kind of this more complex design structure. Because essentially what we're looking at is putting in 2 or 3 bed logs in every structure, cut to fit in the channel to get a low porosity surface in the bottom of this structure from the very initiation of the implementation. Essentially, a piece of wood by itself has much lower porosity than anything that you could build with racking material or fabric. Now, we also have a bunch of racking material and fabric built into these structures as well. They also have a length component to them, similar to the Poison Creek project, where they're not just a single surface in the channel. We're looking at them being a little bit longer because we want water to flow in a complex way through that structure and deposit a lot of its sediment. But in this case, we're thinking about lowering the porosity through both logs and bundles. We're also stabilizing via driven tiles in this case. And in this system, as with Poison, floodplain sediments are really dominated by sands and gravels. And so scour of the sand and the stability as it relates to drop scour around these structures is a major design concern. And so that really played into the depth of these piles and the number of these piles. And then, right, not fish bearing, exactly. And then in some cases we're confining ourselves to the channel itself, but this is an example of one where we're actually extending portions of the structure up onto the floodplain. There is an abandoned floodplain, which currently doesn't wet up in even the 100-year event, but the idea would be if we see as rapid aggregation as we have in Poison Creek, that we may be able to engage that surface both from the surface and subsurface perspective. And so we're expecting the channel to want to bounce up onto this unvegetated floodplain. And so we've added some logs here, where essentially the idea would be as the channel is eroding under them, that these can drop and create some hydraulic roughness immediately in the channel. And then the other piece of that puzzle is to have these in series. So again, we're looking at a tight spacing throughout our project reach with the idea that, you know, if we have the channel bounce around one of these structures, it can get some lateral recruitment of sediment, that sediment is captured by the system and they're working as a whole. So we're not concerned about, you know, one structure failing from the channel and running around it. We're really expecting that on some amount of these structures. So those are the key differences. And then the other piece is that we also had a lot more time to kind of think through monitoring this time and really build on lessons learned. And so in this system, we made 2 major differences to our groundwater monitoring component. So this is our treatment reach in the top rectangle, and this is our control reach, and the colors are elevation relative to the channel. But what we really were looking at is can we, A, hold on to a control reach so that we have a before-after control impact study design, and then B, can we use diamonds and triangles in the floodplain to better characterize not only the local elevation relative to the surface water elevation, but also to be able to start to characterize how flow directions change or don't change through time. You know, we have kind of this conceptual picture of a gaining reach in our volumetric calculations. That's a really nice way of thinking about groundwater and putting some volumetric calculations to it. But what we're finding is that as we're monitoring the system, and even in Poison, we have a portion of that project, the subreach, where we think it's a losing reach. And so being able to better understand the movement of groundwater through the system, and then ultimately setting ourselves up for a potential future piece of this is potentially groundwater modeling to be able to quantify some of these. That's not what we're doing now, but being able to have the data to support that would be a good future step. We're also doing repeat survey to monitor geomorphic change and time-lapse cameras because they tell the story so well. And then kind of the last thought on that is that we've been working with Ecology and CCNRD to put together a draft programmatic quality assurance project plan, a QAP. And part of that has been really thinking through, like, what are the different levels of evidence of changing the groundwater storage and the base flow regime here. So including geomorphic evidence, you know, are we storing sediment and changing the local gradient through time, including groundwater evidence, and including discharge evidence as different ways to approach the same problem. All right, thanks. Whew. Yeah.
Can you go back to
Sure.
slides? I mean, if you're expecting it multiple structures downstream. I mean, it's gonna grade at the furthest upstream, deposit all the sediment. What's the source of sediment once you get below there? It seems like you're robbing your sediment from the structures below.
Right, so, kind of two thoughts with that. One is that we definitely expect to see much more rapid aggradation at the top end, and we're seeing that at the Poison Creek project. But what we're also seeing is that as we have that rapid aggradation, we are having the channel bounce out into the floodplain some and start to cut around. And so then the idea of the kind of the longer structures is to provide some floodplain roughness and plan for that, because essentially that's what you want ultimately. You want it to bounce around a little bit, recruit that sediment locally, and make a more complex channel. So then those downstream structures will grade later through time. And then also kind of providing that stability on the downstream end so you don't head cut up through the whole system. So with Poison, we have seen, we'll be out there today, you can definitely see like the aggradation between the top end and the bottom of the end of the project are quite different. So it remains to be seen how, through time, how much we see that propagate downstream.
Yeah, it seems like you would never have enough sediment, like, produced within the upper part to feed the bottom part. It seems like that'd be really...
Yeah, and that's where some of the locally recruited lateral migration will come into play to kind of rework that floodplain. We'll see. Yeah, and you know, it'll be an interesting thing to better understand, you know, what sections you want to treat through time.
Yeah, or the distance between them. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's where I think with the Valley Reset approach, you know, one of the really elegant things about it, it's like, oh, okay, we need this much sediment. We have it here, put it in, like start it all over all at the same time. Whereas with this approach, we are definitely looking at a more dynamic evolution through time. So emphasizing the pilot project.
And how much was the more constructed Eagle Creek project than the Poison?
I am trying to remember, so.
In terms of all in for, well, we haven't built it yet and we haven't put it out to bid, so we're looking at potentially building it in-house. And so that might save quite a bit of money. So Pete wants to rent an excavator and build it himself. So he's getting excited about getting on the hands-on side of things. The designs, of course, are more expensive, but thinking about it for us is in the context of having certainty around our potential results. We need to have more design certainty, and because of the downstream infrastructure, we heard early on from permitting folks, you know, we can't approve putting large wood in that you're not going to be able to model how long it's going to stay in the stream. So the designs are more expensive, like probably in the $20,000 range or a little bit more. Part of that, again, is like getting to this, trying to develop analogs that we can learn, have lessons learned, and then be able to streamline for future projects.
What type of recurrence were these structures designed for, or were they?
Yeah, Eagle Creek was designed for the 25-year recurrence interval class.
And what about Poison Creek?
Poison Creek, I would have to go back and look, but I think that we actually modeled up to the 50-year recurrence interval flow. That one was a little bit more back of the envelope, but we saw the designs. They were kind of hand sketched. So there were some stability calculations that went into that, but we were dealing with entanglement and dry balance as the primary forms of stability there, which, you know, so you're not getting into the drop scour and calculations of the friction calculations. A little bit of difference.
Was there any consideration made to how these would react once the watershed burns? And potential for breach hydrology from these structures and potential for free flow from them?
Only in a qualitative sense. So I guess on one hand, we're looking at structures that are designed to store sediment. And so from the standpoint of fire resilience, like that's a big plus. But obviously another piece of the puzzle with large fires, it can change your peak hydrology. With Poison Creek in particular, there's actually a giant boulder field downstream of the project area and upstream from the wooden culvert that's the main infrastructure that's been there. So qualitatively, that was kind of the insurance policy around a dam breach, that you're going to get a ton of entanglement on these boulders that the stream goes through. Eagle Creek, much of the reason for having a post-stabilized structure was the protection of infrastructure and getting a higher flow.
I guess I would caution these types of structures. I've seen these that have been put in by an agency that owns a lot of forest land that I'm not going to name. That were put in probably 30 or 40 years ago, and then recently fires have come through and burned, and all of those structures have been completely washed out with devastating debris flow. Because during that 30 to 40 years, they've done exactly what you're wanting to try to do, is building up all of this sediment behind these dams. But in the flip side of that, though, it's charged all of these small dams with a bunch of sediment that are just waiting to be triggered with breach hydrology.
Yeah, which actually is a great point too about kind of the long term, you know, and all of these approaches, I think, in large part are kind of short-term approaches to try to reinitiate a natural process that really depends on big trees, you know, and so there's a, you know, you'd like to see either riparian replanting or, you know, you're also looking at if you have a good system, you already have riparian trees, you're watering them with the system, that's great. But, you know, in the like 10 to 80 year period, you know, where your structure is buried, you know, where does that put you where you don't have big trees? And so it's actually not this project, but another where, you know, we're specifically targeting doing this kind of thing where we already have bigger trees in the system, because you'd like to see through time, as it degrades and is wanting to bounce around, you want it to naturally through bigger wood. And that's the key piece of this puzzle that will hold the system together long term. The big trees that can be naturally and stable.
Susan, there's two questions on the phone from Chris. Do you want to ask your question? I think we'll be able to hear you. If not, I'll just say what you wrote.
Well, one of my questions, and thanks for one of my questions was the fact that you know, a lot of areas we have you know, obviously listed species, but beyond that, spawning habitat is limited, and consequently, a lot of the spawning activity is concentrated. If there was an area in which you would want to do one of these habitat improvement type projects, are you limited, or is there consideration given to where one of these structures may start accumulating sediment over what currently is concentrated spawning activity, knowing that in the near future that spawning habitat may be improved somewhere further downstream because you're trapping a lot of sediment that may be accumulating somewhere else?
Yeah, I can take this as an initial brush and then Susan jump in.
Stand close to the mic, there you go.
Yeah, that's a great question, Chris, that we're really trying to grapple with in terms of our prioritization of projects. And a lot of what we're seeing when we find the areas that have the most restorable water potential happen to be in areas with really high infrastructure. So those beads on our bead necklace are also filled with homes and ESA species and culverts and bridges. And so we're currently not looking at those sites for this type of work. And we've been working to date out of ESA listed, well, basically in non-fish bearing locations higher up in the watershed because it doesn't seem like a suitable approach given all those other trade-offs. And so I think it's an interesting question. Obviously, we don't want to limit ourselves completely from ever working within areas where it is fish bearing, but we're not there yet. And we're really cautious of that, and we recognize that that level of work would require significant more investment in the design and consideration from fish biologists and from the fish community. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
It does, thank you. The second one I had was, you had mentioned in this last example about how many structures you're utilizing, like in concert with one another, that it's not just one single structure. What would be the bare minimum? And I know there's a lot of factors that would probably contribute to that design, but what would be the minimum amount of structures that you would place in one area and still feel like you're meeting the objective or would be effective?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question as well. Because we're thinking about this within the frame of actually changing the hydrograph and getting a hydrograph response. The model results, at least initially, suggest that the more treatable stream reach there is, the more potential for an actual response in our alluvial water storage. And so doing one or two structures, I don't know if we would be able to detect a change in the monitoring results at the level that we are trying to get to. So we've been looking at it as it's like, of course, more is better kind of approach in terms of the cumulative effect so that we can have a response in the hydrograph that we can actually detect. So we haven't done the modeling to say, can you do one structure only, but so far the prioritization results have suggested that the more work you do, the more reach you treat, the more restorable water potential.
Thank you. I have one more question, Greer, if that's okay.
Go for it, Chris.
All right. So I know this is early on, but a lot of places that I'm familiar with, there's a tendency to, obviously a floodplain being flooded is not necessarily a good thing for some people, for some folks that have that perspective. And I'm just wondering, one of the issues is because of this incised channels that we don't have a lot of storage, and water seems to be just routing through a watershed. If you have some hydrological data, some discharge data, prior to putting the structures in, and then after the structures, obviously we're talking about grading this and increasing sediment storage as well as activating the floodplain. Have you seen an increase in base flows since the structures have been in, and what has that increase been?
I can take that. Yeah, Chris, we do have discharge data upstream and downstream of poison. We don't have very much pre-project data, and I think Allie mentioned before, our base flow is less than 1 CFS. So when you start kind of backing that up and thinking about the effect that you expect to see, so maybe if you expect to see a 10% effect, that's 0.1 CFS, and the accuracy on instruments for measuring discharge is higher than that. So poison was a great pilot project for a lot of reasons. In terms of detecting an upstream, downstream difference in discharge, it's not there. I don't think we're ever going to see it, even if it's there. So one of the challenges of this is that we're working in small systems because that's where we can get these projects in and we can kind of try some of this stuff out where there's less risk. But with small systems, there's also less discharge to actually measure, detect, and affect. So there's been 2 studies in California which have shown a difference. We're hopeful that potentially our Eagle Creek projects will have high enough flow to be able to detect the difference, but it's an ongoing key question. And that's one of the reasons, all of this does not hinge upon the discharge effect. That's why we're also monitoring groundwater and geomorphic change and potentially vegetation change, is starting to get at to inferring some of those effects.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
Kristen, and then Crystal on the phone has one as well.
Allie, could you go back a little bit to the water policy rationale behind it and talk about how county sees implementing expertise and in-kind, in place, and time requirements and the means for just doing it more as well.
Yeah. So Susan briefly mentioned at the end, she kind of touched on it, that we've been working on a programmatic craft for the Department of Ecology. So the most important thing in our mind is that we need to be able to monitor this at a level and an intensity that the scientific community, the ecology, and that we have some certainty around that water and its place and time in the watershed. So this is, I think we're ahead of being able to actually implement and develop a debitting system, but the thought being that if we can prove the changes in the watershed and that we are actually increasing base flow and be able to demonstrate that consistently over time and over years, then the thought being that there is more water within these sub-watersheds that are within our theoretical water bucket in terms of mitigation for that type of development. It doesn't mean that we don't want to consider other types of water mitigation, conservation, other types of water banking opportunities, but we're just trying to think through, can we monitor this to that level where we would have some certainty in being able to debit against that. And so that's where we're developing the craft right now, and we're in draft form and in conversation with ecology of how many years of monitoring, and it's basically committing to in perpetuity, potentially, of monitoring sites, excuse me, so you would have some certainty around that, because this is not a, as we all know, we're not able to monitor this around having so much certainty of we put water in here and it comes out here, and there's a lot of gray area in between that. So that is what we're grappling with right now, is what that would look like, what people are comfortable with within the community. And it feels very, we're also looking to California to try and figure out how are they doing this, because they're a couple of years ahead in terms of actually making the water infrastructure legally adopted. The natural water infrastructure is given as much priority on the landscape now as constructed water infrastructure. So how are they now implementing projects and debiting against that? So I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned through this whole process.
What has ecology response?
I think we're still really early in these discussions. It's really happening like right now. Yeah. So to be determined and more to come.
Hey, Crystal, and then hey, go ahead, Crystal.
Thanks, Gurren. Thank you, and thanks, Susan and Allie, for the great presentation. This is really exciting stuff. My question is along the lines of what Kristen just asked, and just kind of curious about the kind of philosophical implications of using transient water infrastructure and alluvial water storage to justify or support permanent out-of-stream uses, and just kind of curious what precedent there is out there for that, because it seems like something to be approached with caution, and I'm just curious what the kind of community conversation is around that.
Yeah, I would agree that we are also approaching it with caution. And I think, being ahead of some of these conversations, it's unknown territory, right? There's no roadmap to determine this, and there's no, there isn't a guidebook that we can go to and say, if we do this, we'll get this result. So we are approaching it cautiously. We're interested in the modeling results. We're interested in the potential. We're not saying that necessarily this is going to be the best fit. We're looking at it as a tool within a comprehensive strategy, and we're trying to think about it within the context of climate change, within the context of development within Chelan County. Is this a piece of the puzzle that we can utilize? And we're working really closely with Aspect on this, and Dan Howler, and we're looking at the water right implications, and we're trying to think through all of that. So yeah, I think both of you guys are raising really important points, and we are sorting through that and are also open to feedback from the community as we navigate this concept. But we also would say we're excited and interested in it and the potential of restoring natural water storage as opposed to immediately turning to some more traditional approaches.
So two more
Most definitely.
Thanks, Crystal. So Amanda.
So you're going to have improved groundwater connections locally here and hopefully downstream of the project. And you're going to try to monitor how far that extent goes. And downstream of this project are a bunch of single-family homes with large lots and lots of green grass. Yep. And a bunch of exempt wells. And Eagle Creek typically goes dry, even on a non-drought year. a connection between the exempt wells adjacent to the creek, and Eagle Creek surface waters. So, you know, if you're storing more water and maybe it's going downstream, how do you, through groundwater as well as surface water potentially? But then what if it's just going to get used by the non-exempt wells downstream? How are you going to show that it's actually providing enough that you could put another single-family house, or, that somebody could subdivide and put another well in for another house? I mean, that part seems really hard to me to prove because there's no limit to the downstream well use, and there's already several homes. So from like geomorphic rock, restoring floodplain connection and all this stuff is good. But actually, in terms of fish habitat is good, but in terms of more development, more concentrated development, and more wells that aren't necessarily regulated, I guess I don't how are you going to be able to show that it's going to have enough of a lift to provide for another home and another exempt well that isn't, aging, there's no, nothing to show how much water they're using.
Right, so all very good questions. I think one thought around that is at this point in our monitoring and in our development of this project, we're looking at being able to track it through our project reach. And
So it's just going to be local.
So we're looking at a localized benefit and where would that extend to. The next question is then when is that downstream, where does that downstream benefit actualize, or where do we lose that, and how would that be impacted? So that's where you get into some of the implications from the Foster division in terms of in time, in place. And so that's where it's an interesting question, and I think that there's no other counties that I'm aware of that are trying to utilize this approach. And so I think it's something that we'll check carefully with. Yeah.
How are you landowners? You work with them?
Warehousing.
Steve, one more.
Yeah, what's the valley setting and locations where you're implementing green structures, and are you implementing these structures in a variety of valley settings, or just one Lakewood Valley refinement? And then what is your target condition from the perspective of potentially changing the system from a Lotic to a lentic system, or is that one of your target conditions? And if so, have you seen that change happen at any of your sections?
Good question. I'll punt that to Susan.
Yeah, so in terms of valley setting, the two pilot projects are in smaller systems than we've been looking at up till this point. So the Poison Creek is a second order tributary that is maybe 100 feet to 150 feet wide in places, even tighter in some places. So we're not looking at a giant floodplain to work with. Eagle Creek is probably about double that, triple that in two places. So kind of that semi-confined with pockets of area for the channel to move around, although it's really interesting in Poison Creek. You go up there and you think, oh, this is a single thread ditch, and it always has been. But, where we've put in these structures, we're seeing multiple threads, we're seeing water in the floodplain in August for a system that was going dry. So, small systems for the most part that we've been working in. In terms of the question about conversion, we're not really trying to target a change to still water bodies. So really, more I would call it a fluvial analog would be like a step pool system. And particularly at Poison Creek where the gradient is around 5%. So we're not looking at this becoming one giant pond behind it. So we're trying to slow things down enough to store sediment behind there, and then essentially use the wood structures as the way to dissipate that stream power. Where you're not changing reach scale gradient, you're changing effective gradient kind of behind the structure. Is that?
Yeah, I recognize that kind of morphology being the target condition. I'm just wondering if you expect to see ponded water behind the structure.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, to some extent, and Yeah, and we have seen ponded water in the floodplain. You've got this big aggregation, and you have temporary floodplain water bodies and water backing up behind it, still flowing through somewhere through there.
So Cody has one more, he's convincing me, and then
Make
it quick though,
Yeah.
quick question, quick answer.
Well, after a lot of fish folks in the room, right? And I guess, the two things on that. One is, like, effective population out there. So I guess I share related to if we can use this people to close and take much more straws in the ground, back out. But number two, so you indicated that your checklist of criteria for where and how to install structure, fish passes is one of the places that you're working right now, you said are not fish bearing. How are you checking that box?
Yeah, I think for the most part, it's because we haven't had to worry about it in our 2 pilot projects. We're essentially making small woody obstructions in the tail, right? And so to the extent that, you have to start to think about, well, what is that maximum height? How porous is the structure to consider? And for these 2 pilot projects, we've been able to say, all right, we're not worried about that. So, I mean, it's something on our radar as we move into different systems. Obviously, discussions around fish passability.
We'll follow you guys.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Find out the
corner.
BDA answer. But you guys some of the comments.
And folks on the phone, mute your phones, and I would say if you have more questions, come out this afternoon, ask them then, because we gotta keep moving on. Great. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Do you have a way to turn the volume
Yeah,
down?
I do. Thank you. There we go. All right, well, hey, my name is Julie Vanderwall, and I'm Conservation Coordinator for Okanagan Highlands Alliance. It's a small nonprofit in North Okanagan County. I'm also Project Manager for the Triple Creek Restoration Project, and so I'm excited to share about our experience with Beaver Dam analogs. I'm going to be referring to the Triple Creek Project for examples and to share the concepts that I'd like to talk about today. So I call it Sticks and Cricks because when I first moved to the States, I was really like, I don't know, tickled when people call creeks cricks. It always makes me smile. And so I've really gotten used to it, and I've kind of grown to love it. Although I haven't said it yet. This is my first day actually saying cricks. So since I'm going to be referring a lot to the Triple Creek Project, I just wanted to give a shout out to our partners. This project has been really giving me faith in humanity in terms of partnership and collaboration because the partnerships have been so effective. And I especially want to thank Trout Unlimited. During the first phase of our project, they really came in and helped us get off the ground and helped connect us with other partners, including the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and they've been instrumental also being out there on the ground, putting monitoring wells in, being out there with us with the post pounder, helping with design, everything. We've had so much help in this project. It's really been a team effort, and I just want to make that real clear up front. And all these other partners also, our landowners have been incredibly supportive. It's private land. It's owned in partnership with a group of individuals. They formed a nonprofit and they manage the land together, and they're really excited about having the wetland restored. So I won't name all of them. You can see the people who've worked with here. But Meha Beaver Prodigy has just recently out at the site helping us weave BDAs. Give a shout out since Alexis here today. Okay, so and our most important partner, the beaver. The site that I'm going to talk about used to have beaver and large beaver ponds filled with trout, heron rookery, amazing high quality wetland. And the beavers have been gone for a long time. But when we first installed our BDAs, I mean, we had seen beavers coming through the site in a transient way each year, a little bit of sign here and there, but they would never stick around. When we first installed our BDAs, 5 days later, the beavers showed up and they stayed for 18 months. They got really interested in what we were doing. This BDA was actually woven by this beaver and its buddy. There were 2 beavers hanging out. We caught them on our wildlife cameras. And before we could get in and weave that post line, the beavers came in and wove it up, and they backwatered it all the way up to the next structure upstream. So it was really neat to see beavers come in and take to the conditions that we were creating
However, there's not a lot of food. There's, in fact, very little beaver food on site right now, and so, you know, they didn't stay for that long, which is okay with me because we planted hundreds of willows and we'd like to give them a chance to grow before the beavers eat them. So, but here's another wildlife camera photo of the beaver adding some material to the BDA. I also just want to thank all the people who have come out to help us weave. This is a crew a couple weeks ago from WDFW. We've been offering trainings on weaving BDAs in exchange for help getting them woven, and it's been really great. And we actually wove ahead of schedule. I feel kind of bad because there were people who were signed up to weave the rest of this month with us, and we had to tell them, we're done. Our techniques have gotten a lot more effective, and I'm going to talk about that today in terms of efficiency and effectiveness. And so things happened a lot quicker this year than any previous year. And we also, here's some Met How Beaver Project folks getting in and helping us out. So it's really been a neat team effort. I was asked to talk a little bit about site selection, and I'm going to start with that and just touch on it briefly because I'm going to spend a lot more time talking about design and lessons learned. But in terms of choosing a site where you want to use this technique, I think it really comes down to what your objectives are. And so maybe you want to create pooling, ponding, maybe water storage is your main priority. Maybe you're looking at inducing meanders and increasing the sinuosity, decreasing the slope, and restoring a wetland like we're doing here. Or maybe you're involved in beaver relocation and you just want to create more favorable conditions for the beavers to want to stay. There could be a lot of different reasons. And so I think site selection has a lot to do with your objectives, in addition to understanding the site and collecting, you know, your baseline information to be able to see if it would be a compatible technique for the site. This is just kind of showing from the air what our project looks like midstream. Here's a before and after. We only have a couple of pictures of the site from before it was incised. I don't know, Joe, did you ever see the site before it incised? Joe Lang?
I don't think so.
No, okay. Joe came out to the site before we started the project and did a lot of surveying when NRCS was potentially going to be involved on site. And so it's neat to have somebody here who's intimately familiar with the site prior to the construction and the restoration. But basically this photo was taken by some local community members, and you can see how the stream level, the water surface elevation is right up there with the floodplain. And then if you look in 2017, you see vertical cut banks. So I'm just going to share a little bit more about the history of the site in a minute. But how many of you are already familiar with this graphic? Because I don't want to, I figured most people probably are already real familiar, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time with it, but just acknowledging the evolution of an incised channel in the presence of beaver. This is borrowed from Michael Pollock's work. And as we put our beaver dam analogs in, we're observing very similar evolution at the Triple Creek site. So here's a photo showing one of the panels. I'll just go back, look at panel F here. So here's a photo showing this kind of happening in our incision trench. You can see our BDA that we put in 2016. And that used to be up to here on me when I wove it. And then here we are with another post line coming in just upstream of it, continuing to step the stream bed up the next year. So I think everybody here is really familiar with the variety of functions that we get with beaver dams. So this again is just to acknowledge that and move right along so that I'm spending time on things that are most valuable to us. I threw in some random slides to mix it up a little. You're on day 3 of a training, and I thought, you know, just some unconventional subtitle slides. This is my daughter taking an overview of a wetland, so I'm going to just give you a little overview of our project here. So in terms of the location, here's Okanagan County. We're up in the very northern part, right near the Canadian border. Here's our project area. Here's the border with Canada. And we're working in the Myers Creek watershed. Myers Creek flows north into Canada, dumps into the Kettle River, and then back into the Columbia. So technically, we're part of the Columbia River Basin, even though we're in Okanagan County. We're not in a really well-recognized part of the Columbia River Basin. And so in terms of watershed planning, when I'm writing grants, I align our work to the Kettle River Watershed Plan in Canada, because that's the most relevant watershed plan that I've been able to find. Here's our treatment reach. When we started our project, we were working with 1,800 feet of stream. We have a lot more length of stream now. and I'll share more about that later. Here's this photo again, just so you can see it a little more clearly, before and after the incision. So we were working with cut banks of 10 to 12 feet when we started in a place. Sorry? So I'm going to share that right now. Actually, we're going to go back a little farther to 1944. This is what the wetland looked like. You can see a beaver pond here, and it's fairly large. You see, look at the vegetation at that time. Really well vegetated. 1983, we've got 2 large beaver ponds now. So this is kind of at the peak, of wetland function on site. And do you see Myers Creek right here? But through the project, it's just a anti-branching, tons of side channels just flooding out over the whole project area. You don't see a single thread. 1995, you're seeing these beaver ponds are smaller. It looks like this dam may have breached. And this is before a rain on snow event that happened in 98. Now, after the rain on snow event, you see this incision trench has formed. And so it's interesting for me because the narrative I had always heard locally was that there was a rain on snow event and it caused the incision. And of course, we all know that things are more complicated than that. Typically, there are, like Susan, I think, mentioned earlier, multiple factors that lead to these kinds of events. But seeing the dam being breached prior to the rain on snow event was really interesting for me. We've had a lot of intensive grazing in this watershed right up to the stream. We've had lots of beaver dams. We've had aggressive logging in the upper watershed, straightening of the channel, removal of riparian vegetation, all of those factors that I think together created a perfect storm so that when the rain on snow event happened, then the channel was scoured out. But I wouldn't point to just that one single event. We really need to look at the whole picture, and we'll never really know the degree to which each of those factors played in. As time goes by, now we're at 2013, now you can really see a marked incision trench. And where the 2 ponds used to be, there's some wetland conditions still and some standing water, but nowhere near the amount of water that there used to be. And now we're just like entrained. Laterally, we're static. The channel hasn't moved for quite a number of years at that point. So this is where we came in and developed our goals and objectives, put our team together, worked with the landowners. They were really excited about using natural processes and trying to kickstart those natural ecological processes. So our overarching goal is to improve the ecological function and complexity within this reach. We're increasing heterogeneity. Our objectives within that goal, we're hoping to increase the channel length, raise the streambed elevation, and then, like our previous presenters were talking about, raising the groundwater surface elevation. And then we'd like to reestablish native vegetation so that beavers can come back in and long-term maintain the wetland here. So I haven't updated this map in the last couple of weeks. We just finished another round of construction, but you get the idea. Over this, originally 1,800 feet of stream, we've now pounded 1,069 posts over the course of, since 2016. We've gone in each year and done adaptive management, and that's what beavers do. So we're trying to emulate the work of beavers. We're going to keep going in and making adjustments. We're in this project for the long term, so we're going to stick with it until we see the results that we're looking for. Did you have a question, Jason?
Yeah, Julie, can you outline the parcel ownership on that map?
This map isn't zoomed out enough to do that. It's a 500-acre parcel.
Okay.
And it's adjacent to DNR and other public land, as well as some private neighbors.
But like a private community.
It is. So back in back to the land movement, it was called Entakaran Circle, and it was lots of teepees and lots of people living off the land.
Cool.
And they worked together to purchase the land, and with the idea of preserving it in its natural state. And at that time, there was a thriving wetland, and like I said, the heron rookery and everything. It was just one of the landowners made a living weaving willow baskets, and she would just go into the wetland and harvest willow. And now we only have maybe 3 or 4 remnant willow, plants on the far side of the wetland. But we've planted, 1,500, so there will be more again. But so that gives you kind of a sense of the land ownership. Now it's down to about 5 households remaining, and they're kind of like little homesteads spread out across the property, and they work together. They have meetings regularly to talk about land management and, make decisions, collect knew when the wetland drained that they wanted to do something about it. They weren't sure what to do about it, and they tried, you know, a number of different options, looking at, you know, some hard engineering possibilities, and then, you know, they ended up settling on a technique that would mimic natural process. So structure design is my next topic. This is my daughter. She's building a cleanup machine and a music machine, and I just thought, you know what, we're designing structures too. So our structures are in the stream. And so we've got 3 different kinds of BDAs that we've been working with. Primarily 2. The third is experimental, and we just kind of started with it this year. So I'm just going to kind of share about those. So the first is the channel spanning BDA. This is your classic, you know, textbook BDA with an arch, and you've got it going across the whole channel. And here we have deflector dams. This is the second type that we've been working with. We knew that we would need to recruit a lot of sediment locally in order to grade such a deeply incised trench. And so some of our BDAs, we left an aperture through which water can flow, and they're a straight line. And that focuses the energy of the stream against the bank and recruits sediment from the bank and induces meandering. And so that's how we've been able to increase the stream length, as well as, you know, recruit the sediment that we need. We've also had a lot of sediment from the upper watershed. We were very fortunate in the timing of our project, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then the third design, just a brief mention. After observing on the site that we saw a lot of deposition in the hydraulic lee of our structures, and after seeing this happen naturally, we decided to try and do it ourselves. And so we're basically just creating these depositional triangles, and anytime you create a flat water surface, you're going to see more deposition. And so we're just experimenting to see if there's even more deposition that occurs with this type of structure. So we'll see. So to show you some examples of these, coming back to the channel spanning BDAs, here's one that we installed in 2016. This is actually Met How Beaver Project crew folks who came out to learn more about weaving and help us weave back then also. And if you just look at the white arrow at the top of that T-post, that's going to be your reference point over time. So this is 2016 in August, and this is 2017 in May. We had one of the highest flow events that anyone can remember, the spring after we put in 27 beaver dam analogs. So the timing could not have been better. And then when the water recedes, this is the following June. And that's Rogues Parish of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. If you know him, he's one of our key partners. He's like over 6 feet tall. And yeah, so we had 4 feet of aggradation in that first year. It was really interesting to hear the different predictions that people made. One of our permitting folks had said, Julie, maybe when your daughter has children, maybe her children will see this stream reconnect with its floodplain. This is going to take a long, long time. And then Michael Pollock came out, he's another one of our partners, and he said, you know what, in the first year, you might see 4 feet of aggradation. That's a pretty good prediction. I don't know if he knew what kind of high flows we were going to get. Here's another, September 2016, so watch the top of that T-post for our staff gauges. And September 2019. So I don't know if that's worth just going back again so you can make sure you got your reference points. Yeah, and so that whole BDA is buried in the stream bed now, and you can see our newer BDA just upstream of it. So sometimes, you know, the functions that we intend are not the functions that the stream decides to deploy. And so I'm just going to show you an example of function reversal where we put in a channel spanning BDA hoping to grade the stream bed, and here it is. It's beautiful. Just look at the right bank where it's located when we started here in this trench. This is basically a straight trench when we started. And the following year, it's flanked. And some people might look at that and be like, oh, our BDA failed. Oh no, but the failures are sometimes the greatest successes. And we were able to recruit so much sediment from that bank. It happened at a location where previously that northernmost large beaver pond was located that I showed you on the aerial. And so as a result, there's a lot of gravel deposited just upstream of that historic beaver dam. And so one of the only places in the whole project area where we have gravel is where this BDA did an end run, and we recruited all that beautiful gravel and other sediment to capture just downstream at our other channel spanning dam. plans, and that's where redundancy comes in. I really appreciated having the other presentation before mine, because he did such a fabulous job of articulating so many of these things that we've also, learned through our experience. And redundancy is super important. The more structures you have, the more the stream has to work with. And basically, the stream is doing the work here rather than an excavator. Our power is coming from the stream itself. So here's a zoomed out shot of that same BDA. You can see just how much it has induced meandering right there. So here's our before and after. It's no longer an incision trench. If you follow the Thalweg, it's now doing a giant S-curve instead of just a straightaway.
Did it degrade at all?
It did. It degraded. And I'm going to show you another picture of this spot in a minute. I think right here, 2.75 feet, where Todd is standing right there. Now, aggradation is really hard to measure because it varies so much, even within one cross section, of course. But it was interesting to see 2.75 feet of aggradation on the, tucked into that place where the water's moving more slowly, even though we didn't get to have a channel spanning structure like we intended. We still had quite a bit of aggradation. So looking at how some of our deflector dams have functioned, and again, these are aimed at increasing sinuosity. Here's one in 2016, and I just put another white arrow in there so you'd be able to track the same spot in space over time. So here's 2017. You can see the bank is moving pretty rapidly. My clicker just stopped working. I don't know why. Should I try this other one? Sorry?
I have to plug it in, though.
Okay. We're stuck on this slide for a minute, so let's just take a closer look at it. You're looking upstream. Okay, that's fine. And this is just a little bit later. The stream continues to push its way onto the right bank.
No.
Sorry. That's okay. It's been interesting for us to watch what the stream does with the structures that we put in. And when we first started out, we were really concerned about micromanaging every location, like analyzing the stream and looking at what we think it might do, what we think we might be able to cause it to do. And the more that time has gone by, the more we've kind of zoomed out with the big picture approach of like, what are we doing in this reach? We're dramatically increasing the roughness. We're giving the stream structure to work with, and good things are happening. And we're much less stressed out over like, oh no, but this one, we didn't want that on the flank. Like that, it's all good. It's recruiting sediment, which is being captured just downstream. Whether it gets captured here or there, it's all going to change anyways over time. So it's an exercise in letting go of control. So here's a deflector dam that immediately when we wove it, it began, pushing against this bank and doing its work. And so it did have its primary function, but its secondary function was aggradation. So if you look at this, can you see where her hands are on the same post? So that's how much aggradation we saw in 3 years, even though it was a deflector dam that was really, dramatically widening the channel. So it's kind of like having your cake and eating it too, which you're not supposed to be able to do, but apparently you can with BDAs. So here's another deflector dam that ended up doing more aggrading than it did inducing meanders. So here's Rogue standing at the bank, and here's Todd standing at the same bank in 2019. So that's 2016, 2019. And so this was a deflector dam. You can almost not see it now. It's buried in stream bed. I think it's because the structure just downstream of it was such an effective channel spanner for the first 2 years that it just kind of filled in the deflector dam. And that's another thing we learned about, like, how to sequence a deflector dam with a channel spanner. You don't want to rob the power from the deflector dam by putting a channel spanner just upstream of it, but you also don't want to backwater it so much that you rob its power. So it's like giving it enough space that the stream can really work around it, but not so much space that they're no longer working in tandem. 2016, 2019. So he's touching the top of the same post. There's the top of the post. There it is. It's gone. 5 feet of aggradation in this spot. Okay, so then the depositional triangles we're aiming at aggradation here. This is a shot we looked at earlier from a drone, and this is a little bit further spread apart because it's two structures that we're working together in tandem, but just look at all of the deposition in between them. And so that's what we're kind of looking at mimicking, and we're just experimenting with the spacing, like what might work best. There's another triangle.
Essentially two deflector dams then?
We've tried it two ways. So this one is two deflector dams, and we also did one that was two channel spanners, and we're going to compare. And we have one that naturally occurred off of a deflector dam that ended up being two deflectors. When we put a channel spanner just upstream of a deflector, and then that did an end run, and so that ended up being two deflectors without us even really thinking about this. But then we wove them both so that, you know, we would hopefully see deposition in between.
Desired outcome, so you start building them downstream before coming.
Yeah.
You don't need to take them.
Yeah. Yeah, I like to observe as we weave. I like to observe the hydrologic effects before weaving the next one, because they do start to function immediately. And so it really is, that's a good point. It really is helpful to start downstream and work your way upstream. When we're post-pounding, we just post-pound, like downstream to upstream, the whole thing, so that we can get that done and out of the way. We've rented equipment. We're in post-pounding mode. But then with the weaving, that's where you really start to observe the effects as you go. So weave design is a huge component of design, and one that I wanted to cover. This clicker is dead also.
I think it has something to do with sorry, the WebEx.
Okay.
I can.
Do you want to just advance it 2 slides, and then I can talk about that? Weave design. Yeah. Okay, or maybe one more. Okay.
There you go.
Yeah. So
if you walk closer when it doesn't work.
Oh, okay.
Intercepted.
Okay.
My EDA.
Yeah. Okay. So when I was asked to talk about design, I thought, well, this is really interesting because there's the structure design, like what we just talked about. There's the weave design, which is part of the structure, and then there's the project design. So we talked a little bit about like the post line structure, and now we're going to talk about the weave and the design of how you use that weave, because that's been a really steep learning curve for us. When we first started in 2016 on this project, we used willow and red osier dogwood. We did another BDA project in 2014 in which we also used willow and red osier dogwood. That's what you kind of read about when you read about BDAs. You know, willow is beautiful to work with. It's so bendy, and it does exactly what you want it to, and it's just aesthetically beautiful also. Beavers love it. So when they show up 5 days after you start post-pounding, and then you weave willow into all your BDAs, guess what? They're like, candy, oh my gosh, this is awesome. This is the most willow we've ever seen in 20 years at this spot. So they like unwove all of our BDAs. Yeah, so willow was not the best choice for us. Maybe it will be for you, but we switched to conifer. And I'm so grateful. And I have to tell you, I was very skeptical. In fact, some of the Met How Beaver Project folks who helped us in 2016 said they had just been weaving with some conifer at a different project site, and it had been kind of floppy and harder to tie in and make it do what you want to do. And I was like, yeah, I can totally see that. I just don't think conifer would be that great. And so when we decided we had to switch to conifer, I was really disappointed. And spruce especially, because it's so prickly and it just didn't seem like it would be that workable. And I love it. I'm so grateful to the beavers for eating our willow and nudging us toward conifers. And I'm going to explain why I love it so much. So here's what we did in 2016. We took our willow and our red osier, and we made the classic post-line wicker weave that you have probably read about. And this is what it looks like. It's pretty. And like my daughter reminded me last night, she was like, you were so proud of that weave though, Mom. Like, I know, I was so proud of it. We were trying so hard, and we were trying to emulate a natural beaver dam. Does it look like we emulated a natural beaver dam? Or does it look like we emulated a really nice wicker dam? I mean, with all due respect, it's a wonderful technique, and it was a great starting place for us. And if it works for you, that's awesome. Like, maybe it will, because every project site is different. So I'm only sharing our experience. But what we found was, you know, it was close. It was a really good try. It was like, oh, we're going to kick the ball. We just missed it, but we were close. So, like, we kept trying. And the next year, we started putting more of the downstream brush mattress pieces in, but it still doesn't quite look like what we want it to. But we're still trying. We're still optimistic. That's 2017. 2018. Yeah, you know, it's starting to look more messy. That's a good thing. 2018. Oh yeah, here we are with a really nice downstream brush mattress. We're starting to get in the game. We kind of know what we're doing. We're like, all right, I think we're getting it. But there's still no brush mattress on the upstream side. And so it's still not quite there. Let's look at, but the downstream side, it does look on that side like a natural beaver down. So we're getting close. 2019, now we're like fancy footwork with Grandpa. Look at this pyramid shape, how wide it is at the base. On both sides, it's really wide. There's a huge amount of roughness also, which we know is important for sediment capture. So here's a close-up. Think about sediment capture in terms of like comparing the wicker weave wall with this like messy conifer base and this broad base. So we're tying it in still. Sometimes we'll use red osier dogwood, but actually this year we used Douglas fir, even for the weavers that tie that brush mattress in. So we're basically placing a lot of conifer boughs parallel with the flow. And then we put in like a row of weavers to lock that in. And then we put a whole bunch more brush mattress down on either side and then lock it in with some weavers. And this is what it looks like when a BDA is woven that way. And here's a close-up. And let's just compare that with our previous technique. There's wide and narrow. Like it's just going to have a very different function in the stream. And you're going to see a huge difference in the amount of scour that you're fighting also in terms of toe scour. Because with this technique, it would work really great for the first few days or couple weeks, and then the creek wants to go under it. So I would be out there with like burlap and cobble and like toe protection. We got to fix this. We've got to repair it. And now that we're making this broad base of conifer boughs, we have very little toe scour because the brush mattress is functioning as toe protection. And guess what? With brush mattress instead of cobble, it's not considered fill. That changes your permitting situation completely. Because now you don't even need a nationwide permit from the Army Corps at all. That's the only reason we had one, is so we could use cobble, so that we could fix, you know, and bolster up the toe. So the design really has implications for a lot of other parts of the project. So here's where we were using cobble. You know, we do have an Army Corps permit, and we have used a lot of cobble, but the more that we've gotten into using the brush mattresses, we just don't need the cobble anymore. And so it streamlines your permitting process considerably, and it is easier to move because cobble's heavy. It's easier to deal with weed seed because it's hard to get clean cobble where you know there's no weed seed on it, but like harvesting Douglas fir boughs, it's just not the same kind of issue. You're less likely to hurt your back or drop one on your toe and have it be a problem. So that's a really great question. Where are we getting all of our materials? It's kind of a cool win-win because, so we're located in Chesaw. We've got a lot of forested ground around us. Our posts are just coming from the site. Our landowners have been doing thinning, and we've purchased the posts from them to the specs that we need, excuse me. But the boughs, we've been going through a lot of boughs. Like this takes a large volume. And so if you drive the main arteries of the Forest Service roads in the Chesaw area, you'll notice like ladder fuels reduction on like all of the roads. So it's kind of fun because we hire our contractors to go out there and lop the trees of the boughs that are, you know, within reasonable reach. And then we end up contributing a little bit to the health of the national forest also. So they've had to drive farther and farther as the years have gone by. Did you have a question right there?
Yeah, will you share the boat?
Yeah. Yep. And I'll talk a little bit more of those construction techniques a little bit later. So other benefits of a robust brush mattress. We're going to watch this BDA just over the course of 1 year. This is one that we put in last September 2018. And here it is woven with a really robust brush mattress on both sides. And here it is as the water rises. And early spring, we didn't have a super high flow event this year, but it did come up on the weave. And then here, when it recedes, look at what we have in between all those branches. I think I have a zoom in, yeah, I've got a zoomed in one for you in a second. It starts to vegetate, it's full of sediment. Now guess what, I get to go out there and put live stakes in there, willow, right? And turn it into a living BDA. I'm so excited. Like, I always had hoped that the willow wickerweed would sprout and that it would become a living BDA. And actually the red osier dogwood was more apt to sprout, and I had a couple where that happened. But they get buried in sediment and flooded out. And with this, if I put a long enough live stake in there, I think we could have living willow and have the whole thing a grade and have the willow continue to grow. So then the bioengineering can become a more prominent part of the project. So I'm super excited about the way that the spruce and Doug fir boughs capture sediment on the BDA itself also. Here's another one that you can just see. This was all conifer boughs last fall, and now it's just completely full of sediment and ready to plant. I mentioned toe scour. This was a BDA that was woven without a brush mattress in 2017. And there's just a cavern, I don't know if you can really see it right here, of the stream bed washing away where the stream wants to go under the BDA. So there are times when we do repair those toe scour issues. Like here, we stuffed multiple bundles of Douglas fir boughs into that hole. That was a hole that like would take you out. I mean, it was big. It was like too deep to stand in. And we decided to repair it. And the following spring, that was functioning as a channel spanner again. So it did work to stuff it with boughs. It just takes a lot of boughs. And there's times where I just let it go too and just like, let's see what the stream does with this. Because we can't micromanage every single spot. In terms of weave design, you can also align your weaves to direct the flow. And so here's a situation where we try to have a weir type shape overall so that our BDAs are lower in the middle. And that helps with fish passage during low flows. It helps with directing the thawag to the center of the stream rather than the sides. If you're kind of hoping that it will stay a channel spanner for a while and not do an end run. So, you know, having that lateral dish and making it like a weir has helped with those two things. And then for the deflector down, we've been weaving them high on the anchor side and then going down to the tip, much lower at the tip. And that again helps kind of encourage the stream to go toward the tip and then to induce meandering around the structure. One of our people here today is in this picture. This is Aaron Rosenblum. He came out to help us do some weaving in early spring. This particular spot, I really didn't want it to flank on the left bank because that's DNR property, and we had just kind of made an agreement that we would try not to alter their property if possible. And so I was thinking it would be good to just put some weave in there, and we really bolstered that whole left bank and made it a lot stronger. And where the thawag had been like wanting to push this way, after we made the weave really robust right here, the thawag ended up coming down off of this side, and it didn't flank on the last. So there are times where you can manipulate the weave to change the way that the stream is moving. There's never any guarantees, but that was a successful adaptation. So we've talked about structure design, weave design. Just a few words about project design. We were working with Rose Parrish of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and so he helped us with putting our design together. We brought different people out onto the site to give us input. Michael Pollock came out, different folks like a soil scientist from the Forest Service came out, different project partners. We had Trout Unlimited and U.S. Fish and Wildlife and WDFW. And then we also had, we were very fortunate to inherit this site with the data set that Joe Lang had done when the NRCS was looking at being involved. And so we entered this project with a full topographic survey having already been done, which was amazing and very helpful. And we've built on that. We've done topographic surveys annually or as often as possible since then to track the changes in the stream, cross sections as well as longitudinal profiles. So it was really great starting off with that information in hand. That normally wouldn't happen, but we've tried to make the most of it. I think overall my biggest lesson learned with regard to project design is that I would rather have more of my budget available for adaptive management than to spend most of it on project design, because it's really tempting. You get really like, you know, we all want to see success, and we get really concerned about details, and details matter. And on a certain level, yes, we have to have a solid project design. But I think you have to be able to see the point at which you've arrived at enough of a picture of what you plan to do that you can go with it and then manage it. Because if you spend your whole budget just dialing out the most beautiful design, the stream's going to do something different anyway. And then you're going to wish you had more funding available to adaptively manage whatever the stream decided to do. So that's just like a really big picture piece of advice. I mean, I just feel like it's important to not be afraid to fail in this kind of context. On a project scale reach, you're adding roughness, you're adding structure, you're giving the stream structure to do its work. So to just try to let go a little bit of knowing what all the outcomes are going to be, and put your best effort forward, but save some money for being able to go in there and, you know, put in more coastlines or adjust the weave, or, you know, take a deflector dam and turn it into a channel spanning dam, or take a deflector dam and punch it out a little farther so you can pinch that aperture tight again so that you can really get more power against the bank. There's just so many little things you can do, like beavers, you know, going in there and this and that, and just adapting here and there and making little adjustments. You want, you know, if at all possible, you're probably going to want to be able to do that. So these are just some screenshots from our initial project design. We identified the locations where we would put our BDAs. We identified whether we wanted to induce meandering primarily or induce aggradation primarily in each spot. We are using these structures in tandem. So where we have a deflector and we're recruiting sediment, we want to make sure we have a channel spanning dam downstream, and preferably 2 or 3 channel spanning dams, because that redundancy is important if you actually want to capture that sediment. So just thinking about the function of each one and how it's going to affect the function of the next one downstream or upstream. This is the area where those big beaver ponds were in the aerial that I showed you initially, and that gravel that we were able to recruit, because this channel spanning dam is the one that went whoop, around and made a big scallop right here. So it was neat to see what the stream decided to do there. If you if you don't have the budget for like an AutoCAD design, you can still do BDAs. I mean, that's the beauty of this technique. It doesn't need to be super, you know, super scientific going into it, because we are just mimicking beavers. Okay, this is a silly slide, but other design considerations. This is my daughter designing some kind of baking machine. Okay, other design considerations. Fish passage was mentioned earlier. So when I'm looking at adaptively managing a structure, if I see something like this, I'm not going to do anything to that. I'm not going to add weave higher. Like I might be tempted to, because there's still some post available for me, but when I see the amount of drop that is already existing, and I see that this weave is actually aggraded with sediment to the top of the weave, I'm just going to leave that as is. There's some water that's coming around the side that you can't quite see here. And so I know that fish can pass through there, and there's a little bit of water coming through in a couple of places. So I know that there's fish passage happening right now, and I'm not going to mess with that because I want to maintain passage. This is a non-anadromous stream, but we do have rainbow trout, brook trout, potentially red band. And so we want to be sensitive to what it's like for the fish encountering all of our structures. If things change and the stream bed aggrades down here, I would weave those posts up to the very top if I felt that, you know, that was appropriate given how everything else had changed. But I just always try to keep fish passage in the back of my mind as we're working and looking at each structure, you know, making sure that there's a good way for fish to get through. When you look at the range, the historic range maps for salmon and beaver, you see how they overlap. We know that salmon have navigated beaver dams for eons, and what we're doing is way more porous than a natural beaver dam. We're just not that good at it. So we know that fish can navigate our dams. It's mainly when they aggrade with sediment completely that I start to like really tune in and make sure that there's a way for fish to get either over, through, or around. And that's where having the weave lower in the middle can help too. How am I doing for time?
I'd say maybe 5-10 more minutes.
Okay.
Questions.
Okay. So another design consideration may be proximity to planting locations. How many folks are doing riparian plantings concurrent with stream restoration? Does Is that an issue for folks here? Yeah, okay, some people, not everybody. For us, we're trying to establish riparian vegetation because we want to bring beaver in long-term, that's our goal. So we need to have lots of willow and red osier dogwood and aspen and cottonwood available for them. And so doing BDA work concurrent with planting has been really tricky, and I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'll just share one lesson learned that was like, if somebody could have told me this 5 years ago, it would have been really great. But this is a planting location that I put in right next to the stream. Here's the top of the bank and the incision trench in 2015. So we fenced it. We're really close to the stream. You might look at that and be like, that looks risky. But I'm going to show you why it works. And then we have one that didn't work for the same reverse reason. So here's our planting plot. It's doing really well. And here's the location of the fence you were just looking at. Here's the incision trench, and then the BDA that we put in right here, which was the channel spanner originally. So if you look at the plan form, you can see that the stream is going around a bend right here. If it's going to flank on this BDA, it's going to flank on this left bank. You can just see the power of the stream coming around and going through that side. It's really unlikely that it's going to flank right here. That would just, unless it came straight through. Anything is possible. But in, sorry?
Flow is left to right.
Yeah, sorry, flow is left to right. Yeah, we're flowing this way. So the stream's coming around like this. And so because this planting plot is tucked in on an inset floodplain on the inside of a meander, it ended up being safe. You can see what happened in this drone image. There's our BDA. And the stream did come around this bend, and it did blow out on the left bank. And then it's making an S curve, and it's starting to work the right bank over here. But our planting plot is safe on the inside of that meander. I have another planting plot that was on the other side of a meander that's having a much more rough time in life. So, just in terms of planting plots and proximity to BDAs and siting your BDAs, it makes a lot of sense to put your planting plots on the inside of a meander. And that's just something that I didn't have in mind when we started. We were doing all of our planting on the right bank so that we could irrigate. And so I didn't consider left bank at that time because I wouldn't be able to irrigate. Here's that same BDA if you want to see it over time. There's a static point in space. Oops. Okay, so that's in the first year. So there's your white arrow, and then there's the stream and the stream bed in relation to that white arrow the next year. We put in a new post line, and then the following year, the BDA flanked. And now we have a beautiful, huge meander, and we've recruited all this sediment that we can then capture just downstream. So some results to share with you. Here's what it looked like in 2014, 2017, in terms of the incision trench. I mentioned we've been doing topographic surveys, and so we were able to measure the channel length, and we had an increase in over 25%. We haven't done a topo survey since 2018, and so we probably have had, we've had much more lengthening since then also, but we've had at least, 500 feet more channel length developed in these 2 short years. We've had a reach scale flow production of over 19%. So as that channel gets longer, the slope gets less and less. And that's part of our goal in trying to bring the stream bed up and restore this meadow system. So here's our long pro. If you just want to look at 2015 to 2017, we have more data that I just haven't had a chance to integrate yet in this kind of format. But even just in that first year, because we constructed in 2016, in that first year, you can see the biggest change happened in the middle of the project area. We tied our project area in at the upstream and downstream ends. It's where we have the least amount of incision. So we're tying in with less incised portion of the reach, and yeah. There we are during high flows. We're almost, the water's almost at the floodplain. So close. But that was a really high flow year also. There were some questions about construction. So yes, we used a chainsaw to shape the posts at the top and to sharpen them like a pencil at the tip. So we had to shape them at the top to fit the pneumatic post pounder chuck. And we just take a piece of PVC the same size as the chuck and test every post. so that you don't end up in the stream like, nope, that one doesn't fit. Oh, give me a new one. That one doesn't fit either. We learned that the hard way. So it may look like it fits, but you need to really test it out. The first year we used a track hoe with a thumb attachment to hold the post pounder, but we ended up finding that was just slower. Having to direct the driver like a little to the left, a little to the right. It was faster just to manually hold the post pounder, put it over the post, and move on to the next one. And you can tip the post back to get the pounder on and then straighten it up.
How much does the pounder weigh?
This is a pneumatic post pounder, and so it weighs about 65 pounds. The hydraulic pounder that we experimented with this year for one day was extraordinarily more heavy, because when you look at the specs on the website, they tell you how heavy the pounder is, but they don't come out and say you have to add all these other attachments that make it even heavier. And then you've got the hose that's filled with fluid, which is also heavy, and it's extraordinarily more heavy. I mean, it's like orders of magnitude more heavy and difficult, we found, in our situation. Now, we have great access, so we can drive an ATV or a tractor or a truck pulling a big air compressor to power the pneumatic hammer. And so we have the luxury of using the pneumatic hammer because they have really good air compressor access. But we're going to be looking at experimenting with smaller air compressors to see just how small you can get and still have enough power, because there are some places where access is a real issue and you may need to use a hydraulic hammer. But it's just different considerations. Once you get into such a heavy hammer, you may want shorter posts just to make it easier. You want really tall, strong people. Our pneumatic hammer was brand new, and it broke at the end of day one. And at first it's like, oh no, it broke. And then we got back to the pneumatic hammer, like, yeah, this is great. Thank goodness. So we'll just stick with the pneumatic hammer for our purposes, since we have good access. We've been aiming for 50% embedment on all of our posts. You can cut a little line with the chainsaw so that you can feel where that 50% is with your toe as your post moving, so because it's hard to check underwater or keep getting your tape measure out. You can make height adjustments. This is our downstream most BDA, and it's the most robust because it's kind of like the catcher's mitt. It's the last chance to catch whatever may come loose in the project area. So having 2 or 3 more robust channel spanning structures on the downstream end can be really helpful. Photo monitoring has been really fun. You can tell that I enjoy it. This is looking down into the incision trench over a period of 3 years. And it's nice to have reference points, whether it's people or a staff gauge or a T-post or something that stays the same throughout. I don't really have time to talk about project monitoring, but we do have some transects and some individual random groundwater monitoring wells, surface water monitoring wells, which also capture temperature data. We had 2 dissolved oxygen data loggers, one at the downstream and one at the upstream end. We discontinued those because we weren't getting enough useful information from them. But this is our transect, and you can see there's basically just the same thing that was shared in the last presentation, how the incision trench is functioning as a drain. And I can share with you a little bit of data. I haven't had a chance to analyze our data very much at all yet, but this is the groundwater level adjacent to the stream. And you can see in 2016 where we were at for minimum groundwater at level elevation, and then the next year up here. So it'll be great to be able to analyze our data more. And actually, if you know of a grad student who's looking for a project, we've got an amazing data set. And we are looking to partner with somebody who would be passionate about making good use of that data. So let me know if you want to have a conversation about that. We've collected quite a lot of data since before construction. Temperature data, I'm not going to try and make a causal inference here today, but just to share with you a couple interesting points, that we saw our peak temperature being 2 degrees lower, degrees Celsius, at 3 of 4 locations, compared to like the beginning of construction versus a couple of years later. Our peak temp was 7.5 Celsius lower at the 4th location. And then we looked at our end of July temps, and they were 11 degrees lower at that 4th location too. And so what I think we're just seeing is with the increased heterogeneity, that may be driving some local habitat scale changes, like at a habitat feature scale. I can't speak for the whole reach. But it was just interesting to see the temperatures change in these ways in the points that I did look at. this is a surface water monitoring well turned groundwater monitoring well. You just never know. I think I might be out of time, so there's always more challenges to talk about. But let me just skip through quickly. Oh, the Chinese symbol for crisis is like danger and opportunity in the same symbol. So like when things look like they're bad, they may be actually wonderful, a wonderful opportunity. So this is just, I'll just flip through these in case there's any salient points I want to hit before we go. Species selection, just planting all different kinds of species because we don't know what the future conditions will be. That's worked really well for us. Yay, that worked great. Mowing, if you want to talk about reed canary grass, come find me afterwards. We found that mowing in the shade has been really effective. It looks like it was sprayed with herbicide. If you compare the shade versus the sun, that's the same treatment. So I'm happy to talk with folks about that, or if you want to contact me later. The whole riparian planting part has been really neat. Yay, okay, so that's our website if you want to learn more, if you want to check out our project video, if you want to see more like before and after. There's a case study that you can download. This a draft. We're going to update it this year because we've learned so much since we drafted it. But if you go to this link, you can learn a lot more about our project and you can contact me if there's anything you want to talk about.
Great. Thank you. So we'll take like 3 questions, and then the other questions we can follow up with Julie during the break. What's that question?
Great job. It was just fun hearing your passion and your energy. It's a really great project. Since you're kind of adaptively managing year by year, how do you, like, questions on cost? Think of cost per mile, per acre, how do you, like, over a 10-year period, what do you spend per acre?
Yeah, it's really hard to quantify because if you want to just know about construction costs, during our first phase, we probably spent about $1,600 per BDA. So that includes permitting, all of the baseline monitoring related to permitting and planning. It's not just like going in there and putting the structures in. That includes monitoring to some extent. So it's really hard to know like how much to include. If you include the riparian planting component, that's a very expensive component. And I've looked at that as, like $80 a plant is what we've spent so far, I believe. But we have like 87% survival, and our plants are doing really extraordinarily well because we're giving them irrigation, sheet mulch, drought protection, everything you can do for a plant. So we're spending a little more per plant, but we're getting really great results. So it's really hard to quantify the cost because, like you said, do you do it per acre? Do you do it per structure? Do you do it per year? And I guess I need to sit down and like try some different ways of breaking it down that I would be able to share other than what I've shared just now.
Per acre would be great.
That's a tough one because where do you draw the line for the project area? There's our cultural resource survey where we chose, this will be our area of maximum impact. But we might restore the wetland outside of that area, or we may not have an impact that big. So it's even hard to know how many of the acres to count.
You're so close to the top.
Yeah.
You'll get there.
Yeah, it does seem like.
If you're changing water table, it makes sense within that valley.
Okay, well, I'll have to get back to you on that. It's a 500-acre property ownership, but we're not impacting that whole 500. So yeah, thanks for making me think about it that way. So look at those numbers and get back to you. Yeah, Joe.
So you kind of were getting at it, so you're not quite sure about your project area, but that's also maybe what's like the long-term goal there. When are you planning on stopping?
So our long-term goal is to reconnect the stream with its floodplain. We thought that was going to be so long-term that we haven't fine-tuned that yet to say, like, for what duration do we want to see what amount of standing water on the floodplain to consider ourselves done. And we're approaching that so rapidly now that I do need to, come up with a more fine-tuned metric for when we're done. And I've had people suggest different kinds of metrics for success. And it's really interesting to consider different ones because there are a lot of different ways of looking at it. We want to see beaver back on the site, maintaining the grade control.
know, I was on the WebEx.
I know, it's
in and
a
out.
real bummer.
I'm sorry,
So,
I had, yeah.
are you familiar with stage zero
Yeah.
restoration? Okay, so, knowing what you know now and of the success, and it's impressive, but with the stage zero, which would you do if you were going back in time?
Yeah. For me, I would go with this approach, and there are a number of reasons, but one is that the landowners wanted to use a light touch. We wanted to use the most cost-effective techniques that we could find. We wanted to mimic natural processes and jumpstart natural ecological processes, like in a very light touch kind of way. The landowners really didn't want major excavation, hard engineering structures. Like, there's a lot of things that, you know, go into that decision. And for this site, this has been the perfect technique for us because it works well for everybody. And it has a lower impact and potentially a lower risk in terms of disturbance. Although I don't want to offend anybody here. But in terms of a light touch and a low impact and just jumpstarting natural processes and having beavers take over, our confidence level is pretty high for having success doing it this way. And not to say that somebody else can come in and do a grade line approach and have it be wildly successful. Our organization might not choose that approach.
Right.
Given also we're a very small organization, we have a total staff of 3. I'm the only full-time staff member. So, you know, we're doing a lot. We're monitoring a gold mine, and we have an education program and a restoration program. And so we also have to look at what we can take on organizationally. You don't want to have a site like that where you didn't have a little resources that are going to how would you approach that?
So again, not assuming we would have the constraints of landowners when they go light touch. We have places in the Oregon Coast Range that are very, it looks like regenerative grass, really regenerative grass. Very difficult places to work with. That's a top system with all that regenerative grass in it. We've done full regrade, so we're basically grading the valley bottom and using the material. So you're starting over.
Does that mean that you have, like, you're dropping that whole thing?
Yep. You do anything with the regenerative grass, or does it just become part of the fill? Bury it as deep as you can. And you're never gonna get rid of it all. Do you scalp it though then and intentionally use it deeper in the horizon? Yeah, Paul Burns over on the Oregon coast, what he does is he scrapes that whole sod mat up, and then he piles all his material on top of it and kind of composts it for a year. And then he uses that as fill for the fall.
Yeah, we did some scalping, and we used the material to plug a wetland drainage channel, to partially plug it and plant it. As far as the regenerative grass management goes, smothering it with cardboard and wood chips has worked extremely well for getting, like, small, intensively managed plots established. And then there's no competition. It's all willow. It's worked really well. It's a little labor intensive, but yeah, and I'm happy to talk to folks more about that because we've experimented a lot with different regenerative grass treatment approaches.
Thanks. That was great. We're going to take a little bit, well, I only have 15 minutes to break anyway. So 15 minutes, let's say 10:45. We're a little behind schedule, but there's a little wiggle room in the schedule.
Yes.
I'm playing a card. Yeah, you bet I do.
Thank you. I'm sorry I missed Wednesday. I really wanted to, but I came in on the WebEx in and out as much as I was able.
So I might have missed it, but, did you,
Back on the job.
so, you know, when the incision first occurred, I don't know what maybe.
98.
98.
That's okay.
So have you addressed the sensitivity or the top effect of that incision? And so, you know, if you build everything back up, clearly it was already up there, but you create other stuff. it looks great.
Yeah.
We're in the January flood season.
Yeah.
5 years from now, we'll have another for another timber cut
Yeah.
up stream. Well, so, I mean,
So we had a historic high flow in 2017 that may have been higher than the 98 flood because there are people who have lived in Utah their whole lives and said they never saw stuff like that. And so I think that allowed our project to be more effective. If our structures hadn't been in place when that flood event happened, it may have been sized more deeply. So we've already been tested by 2 extremely high safety events.
no problem. They just changed all of our.
Okay.
Yeah, so all our cars are.
That's fun.
And, well, I never. Oh, come on.
So we've been tested for 2 years in terms of high flow, and it only enhanced the ability of our structures to be effective. So I feel pretty confident about, what if there's another high flow event? It's not to say that you couldn't have another down cutting event. You can't completely.
Whatever. Right. Yeah. I guess that's we talked about it with the smaller structures. Too. It's kind of. It doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of risk in this site. I mean, it's the sites we're going to look at, but there's like this planning. What temporal scale are we looking at, right? If you're looking at, 5% down, we're kind of thinking in mortgage time frame 3 years. Okay. But, if you're looking at trying to how to deal with that.
Yeah, we want beavers.
Clearly it can happen.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it can happen, and it's going to reconnect fairly soon. What we need is beavers to come in and colonize the site again. And they're going to do the work into the future, not us. And that's really the ticket for us being able to say, okay, we're done.
So what happened, that first, Tampa, the beaver dam?
No idea. No idea. It's like a mystery. I mean, the landowners weren't even aware that, first the dam breached and then the rain on snow event. I only know that because of the area. So to them, it was just like,
all of a sudden it's gone.
yeah, what happened? So I wish there was somebody who knew. But, beavers do come and go.
Well, that's true.
But it does seem a little odd in such a well-established site with such a huge pond and so much willow available. Everything.
Well, and you also turned into a down. Sometimes even talking to Joe about.
Yeah, seriously, you're like, I don't want to show of any.
We're working on these projects where we're doing purchase flow. It is, kind of, like I said, maybe it's 30 years. But some of these things may happen. You may get extreme outbreaks that happen just like that. Take the whole channel. Nobody's got a monitor. Nobody has it. It's been major.
Answer questions
all
on the
of a
phone.
sudden you wake up and it plays out.
Okay.
Where's this?
We'll do that after. All right, let's.
That might be it. I don't know.
Good.
Well,
Super interesting. Yeah, thanks for asking good questions.
Yeah, so you're just kind of looking at the immediate test for success. We'll get it back and then see what happens after that.
Yeah, we'll either, it's going to be dependent on whether there's enough vegetation to support beavers. Is our veg going to grow fast enough that at the point where we want beavers to take over, we have enough vegetation for them, or do we need to keep doing the work until we can get more willow?
So that's another interesting question. You've been at this for 4 years. What's your total cost over that 4 years?
Over 6 years, it'll be 400,000, just over 400,000. I meant to say that when Johan asked me a question about it.
So $50,000.
Sorry, I didn't have this table, so I couldn't use my computer, so yeah, go use your computer.
Yeah, let me pull up my calculator.
Usually works out our big event.
Yeah. But
we couldn't get audio to work.
I think it was yeah, it was like 423 over 6 years, so that's like 70 a year.
Oh, so you did it.
And then
for everybody, so that's
5 more years, yeah, that's
another time to go.
yeah, that's great.
Like now or
No, yeah, it becomes cheaper. Yeah, it's become cheaper. I think I need to really break that down and look at each year, each project component, because
So I don't feel like
yeah, you could. Yeah.
That would actually be kind of cool. Actually, that
when it goes bad.
Yeah.
That was bad.
Yeah, I'd like to sit down with the figures and look at we got 5 components to our project and look at the cost of each and look at it each year versus cumulatively and see which ones are getting cheaper. Construction is getting cheaper because we're getting better at it and we're getting more self-sufficient with it. We're not using an excavator. We're not hiring as much labor. We're like our team can basically do it. We hire one contractor for help, just a body. No, like, we're renting this pneumatic founder.
Well, actually, talk about the teams doing it. So if you're using, I work on the board, right? If you're using, counterproductive too, and you're hiring contractors,
It's funny now that you say that that wasn't you. I was wondering how you were involved with that. Your brain short-circuited. I have a meeting coming up and we're so weird. I totally forgot about collaboration. And that, I really appreciate that because I wanted to, maybe you thought it was me and you were talking to that person. Like, come on, somebody that had, yeah, you can do well for me, right? Thank you. And then I was doing how it happened that, yes, 4 years ago. Right. I know, yeah, it's like, how old are you? 5 and 8. Okay, so yeah, that's, I don't know. When did you start with this? I was before that, that's what I thought. Okay, yeah. As a volunteer at Bernie. I went to do my degree.
So it's that whole upfront cost. So if you're doing your total cost is the same, product being given.
My daughter and I are going to stay in the Metro Valley.
So it may cost,
Shooting things, I'm keeping down there. She's not even
but if you're not,
but that's good to hear. So I wondered, I'm trying to, that would be really before I had this job, I was like, okay, it's really cool for 1 year. I was laying it down in the areas. I was hearing good things about this show. And then I got right, go for it. Oh, yeah. Walking out down there. Everything has to evolve. Yeah. You shouldn't primarily have to
chair out.
Yeah, there is a human, like,
nice
And
to
you
see
see
you.
the value for sure. That's awesome. I never thought about it. You know, outdoor. Yeah. That's great. Well, you can put it under the umbrella of outdoor recreation.
Yeah.
That is legitimate. Yeah, we're watching, you're watching, and I'm gonna add you to it. You're right about yeah.
Hey, awesome.
Thank you.
Well, I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
So if you start, I think one thing to, actually all of it.
That's not what I do. I'm a grant administrator. But he does the best administration of any grant. Yeah, good meeting. Thanks.
Hey, no, I
That's pretty amazing. Yeah, I can't believe the response they've gotten so quickly. Well, I just wonder. Yeah. I got a lot. Yeah, exactly.
Hey, go ahead and take your seat. Bye, guys. Yes, Julie still. Folks on the phone, I realized I didn't allow you to ask questions of Julie, so if you have questions for her, just write them down, and when we have our time for questions after Alexa, I'll point to you to ask questions to Julie. So, and this time I will remember after Alexa talks. So everyone, if you kind of notice in the agenda, we have a gradient of heavy-handed to light-handed approaches to getting floodplain inundation with different levels of certainty of success and different levels of cost and implementation and design. So the last talk that we're going to have today is talking about beavers, who are definitely the lightest touch and have their own associated challenges. So go ahead and introduce yourself, and then after Alexa, we'll have some time for just group questions, and then we'll talk a little bit about field trips. Thanks.
Hey, Greer,
Yes.
one question, are these presentations going to be made available?
Yes. So I'll send all that out to the everybody who's registered online. I have your emails. I will send out all the links. There'll be a web page I have a workshop web page on the UCSRB site, and I'll post all the talks, and I've been recording the WebEx too, so you can watch the whole WebEx. Not the people, but the voices in the presentation, and then any associated resources that people have will also be posted. And I'll follow up with any additional conversations going on after this regarding Phase 0 and floodplain work. Go ahead.
Good morning, everybody. Alexa Whipple. I am the new project director with the Met Howe Beaver Project. And Greer, thank you for bringing all of these great projects, great minds, great agencies, organizations together so we can all continue to collaborate and learn from one another. I am 4 months into this position with the Met Howe Beaver Project, but have been involved with the project for about 4 years. I did my master's research on beaver restoration after fire, after the Carlton Complex fires in the Met Howe Valley in 2014. And this beavers on the landscape from the Met Howe Beaver Project, relocating them, really inspired that work after seeing what fires could do to streams, especially low-order streams, after big storm events right after fire. So just a little background on me. I'm a wildlife biologist. I'm also a farmer, worked in sustainable ag production for 15 years in the Met Howe, and kind of came back to ecology just as things progress with climate issues and social issues and ecological issues. So I work with a crew of anywhere from 2 to 4 people and a ton of volunteers. We have a very strong group of volunteers in the Met Howe and a lot of folks from out of town that have second homes that are really wedded to the Met Howe, even if they don't live there full time, and we take full advantage of their energy out on the project. And so what I really want to talk to you all about today is to try to pull this back into restoration and how beaver fit into all the different tools that should be in everyone's toolboxes, or at least access to people who can provide those tools. And one of the big questions we get from even folks in restoration or wildlife management is, if beavers are so good at restoring degraded landscapes, why aren't they doing it? Does that seem like a funny question? Yeah, I agree. I mean, you all know the story of beaver. Most everybody in here is probably really familiar, so I'm not going to go through a ton of the history of beaver or the biology of beaver, but they were nearly extirpated for their pelts, but also as a political move, trying to make a fur desert out of the West, so a young American nation might not succeed as well as we did. A lot of issues there with them being pulled off the landscape. I look at them as part of the triangle of land formation, geology, hydrology, and beaver. Those three work together incredibly well when allowed to do so, and they haven't been allowed to do so very well over the last 200 years, at least in the Pacific Northwest. The other reason, the call out to Stage Zero and Kate in particular, you can't stick a beaver in a boulder ditch and hope for any dramatic change. Okay? So I'm here to talk to you about where beavers are appropriate and when and how to make some of those best decisions from the Beaver Project experience. I expect Cody and others that have had experience with beaver now too to chime in either during my presentation or during the question and answer portion for sure, because there's no one right way to do this. There's lots of ways, and there's some wrong ways, and we've learned from that, and I want to share those with you. So an overview of what I'm going to talk about: challenges to beaver restoration and relocation, successes in the Met House, there's been a lot of them, what's next, and what we've learned about beavers and process-based restoration. I will just say, that's Black Canyon. After fires, we have dropped beavers in Black Canyon Creek many times over the last 11 years. They never stayed where we put them, but they did end up colonizing this spot and are now working on a series of terraces off of a spring that is feeding into the channel above the channel. So there's no like one way beavers do things. They're not in Black Pine Creek. They're on the side of it, but they're saving water there. This is this year. So it's spectacular what they can do. Now, challenges in severely degraded systems, which is most of what we have, especially after fires, but from grazing, timber, mining, agriculture, floodplain development, just human water abstraction for agriculture, it's a big impact on our landscape over the many decades and 2 centuries now in the Pacific Northwest. So cattle, as you can see in the picture on your right, the Taylor 1990 photo, just that white line going across the picture.
You said the middle, the red one.
Yeah. This white line is a fence line. We drew in a white line so you can see it well, but this is where cattle are excluded, cattle not excluded.
Wow.
So grazing has been the largest impact on Western streams for 200 years. Mining, timber, they don't hold a candle to the broad scale impact that grazing has. And grazing is not a natural part, this kind of grazing is not a natural part of this ecosystem, at least history that we understand of the last 10,000 years, because bison were not up here, and nothing else grazes like that in our system. So there could be a place for livestock in a sustainable way on this landscape, but right now we're not practicing that, and others are across the West, and we need to learn from them really quickly. Sustainable grazing, range riding, moving cows regularly. There's a lot of different options that we're not using. So if anyone wants to talk about those, that's another area of my interest. And even when we do have beavers on the landscape, cows can come in and wreck it really fast. They're big, they love the water, they don't like to be stranded out in the dry areas if they can access that highland water easily. So my coworker Alex put this together. Creativity, so thank you, Alex. Wildfire is the most recent large-scale degrading impact, mostly because of the scale and the lack of regular burning. You know, we've had a suppression for over 100 years on our forest, and it's starting to fight back, basically. And what we're seeing is such incredible geologic scale incision on a lot of our landscape that I started really wondering how these areas are going to recover. We can't go in and do river engineering on every little low-order stream tributary, and they need it. They really need it. So what do? We don't have the funding for that. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about how much of our landscape. This is a little fire tableau that I put together for my master's research. And this is the Methow River watershed right here. And all the orange, well, you see the streams in gray, and all the orange is fire boundaries over these different time years, for the last 20 years. Some of you might know these fires well. That's Tripod, Carlson Complex, Twist River Fire and Black Canyon Fire, Diamond Peak, McCloud, and Crescent Mountain fires. So you can see that close to half of our watershed has burned in the last 20 years. Some of it's patchy, some of it's not. We have moderate to high risk erosion potential on over half of the Carlson Complex burn, about 200,000 acres of 300 some burned in that fire. So this is what a lot of the channels look like on our forest. This is Benson Creek. There are some extreme circumstances on Benson Creek, but there's multiple channels or tributaries of Benson Creek. But this is one of them, and the others look similar. Maybe this one's the worst. But as you can see, that's about 3 meters of erosion right there. So we get severe channel incision and increased velocities, loss of floodplain connection, reduction in riparian habitat and complexity, subsidy exchange, vegetation with lowered groundwater, and we reduce that flood abatement. And there's nothing but time that's going to change that under these circumstances if we don't add anything to it. So a lot of you will recognize this sort of reduced stream evolution model that Pollock created from Fleur and Thorne's work of stage 0 restoration. And I like to use a simplified model because it shows well the kind of if you were to have rapid change from this dynamic equilibrium stage, sort of stage 0 system, and you had a severe incising event, and then you went into a widening stage and then into a grading stage and back to stage 0, that's easy for everyone to kind of wrap their heads around if you're not real familiar with stream evolution. But what I was really shocked by was that this is a logarithmic scale. This can take thousands of years and even longer when you have the geologic level events of incision that we had with erosion after fire, big storm events right after fire, same season. So what I looked at was how beaver are impacting those burned systems 4 years after fire. So my study occurred in 2018. And here's what I found. In cross sections, and my research has several different aspects to it, but what I'm going to share with you right now is cross sections. In beaver systems that Methow Beaver Project had helped reestablish, primarily historic beaver sites that were then reintroduced upon by the Beaver Project over the years. This system is a historic. Yeah, I gave it all away. This system is a historic beaver site with no fires in the last 70 years. And this is the cross section. We have really deep pockets, and we have a really, basically a shallow cross section with a high width depth ratio for bank pools. That's a good thing generally for complexity, for biodiversity, for water storage. Here is a 2014 stream channel that was impacted by fire, and you see the width depth ratio is much lower. We have a very incised channel where even at high flows, 2-year flows, Q2 flows, even 10-year flows, this channel is not getting out of its bank. And then, lo and behold, beaver in a burned system jumped all the way into what looks like a widening phase in the same amount of time. This was over 3 different sites. There were 3 sites that I looked at in each category. Beaver with fire, beaver without fire, no beaver, fire, no beaver, no fire. So a factorial study. And this was what I found across all the beaver burned sites, is that where beavers were after fire, they were aggrading into a widening stage of stream recovery and evolution. So, where the gradient is low enough to support beaver, even in severely incised and burned systems, they can get a foothold back in there. So that was one thing that I was really inspired and wanted to share with folks, is looking at those severely incised channels after fire. It's not hopeless, and beaver still are potentially one answer to recovery and restoration in there. But now I'm going to go on to the challenges that beaver face in being restoration tools. And there's just a summary of the two. This is a currently hydrologically significant beaver site. Beavers are no longer actively present here, but their dams are still holding up as of right now. Yep. For the beaver with fire sites, were those like localized attacks kind of extreme locations, more like no beaver, no fire? So I did an entire model similar to the GRAP model, but I didn't even know about the GRAP model when I did it. So I made a GIS model where I looked at gradients below 10%. And I looked at watershed sizes where I knew beaver were from the Methow Beaver Project in both burned and non-burned systems. I took those watershed sizes and then found a similar paired watershed size that had beaver or no beaver in a burned and non-burned system. So then I went and did cross-sections both within beaver ponds above their lowest dams as well as below any beaver influence to try to capture what it was like after fire, before beaver moved in. So it's not perfect in being able to say it's the exact same size watershed, but I went for similar valley width, similar slope, similar veg potential. That's where, after fire and incision, you don't really have the veg there anymore, but there was the abandoned terrace, or floodplain terrace that you could tell was 4 years ago were probably similar. So I tried to marry them as best I could in pairing of them, and then look at downstream, even where beaver were, to try to capture what it might have been without beaver. Okay, so also in the degraded systems, you're losing biodiversity, you're losing resilience for the future, and refugius for climate-sensitive species, which not all species are, but a lot of them are, and ones we really care about. How do you know if your site is right for beaver? So this is where we get into some of the challenges of putting beaver in a site, especially a degraded site. How do we know they're right for beaver? Well, if you just walk up to it, you might think, if you don't know a ton about beavers, you haven't gotten into it yet, but you've heard like how great they can be, you might just look at a site and be like, oh, there's a couple willows there. I'm just going to throw them on there and see what happens. There's wood. I mean, there's plenty of wood for them to work with there. So how do we really know? Now, my coworker Alex likes to channel his inner beaver every time we go out into the woods, and I appreciate that so much about him because he has a lot of insight to share with me and with our other staff and volunteers. So we've also developed some tools to help us know whether our assessment of sites is worthy of beaver or not. So we're looking at gradient between 2 and 10%. We're looking at vegetation, deciduous and herbaceous primarily, although beaver will have starvation foods that they'll take advantage of, conifers. Pool depth and area for escaping predation is a huge part, and connectivity to other habitat when they decide they don't like where you put them, which is just this time. Do they have another place to go nearby that they might make it to?
Like is elevation a limiting?
Not so far as we've seen. The only limitation with elevation currently is that they haven't been up there for 150 years, most of them, and they're not connected with good habitat or with other beavers. Beavers are very social, even though they are territorial. They can be monogamous until they lose a mate, and then they're going looking for a mate. So
survive in alpine lake.
Oh yeah, in Colorado, they're up in avalanche bowls. They will just hang out in avalanche bowls up at 14,000 feet.
Like a great opportunity for water source beavers reintroducing their alpine lake.
And out of Utah State University, if everybody is familiar with Joe Wheaton and his legacy that he's creating over there, grad student named Hassan did a study on can beaver replace snowpack on the landscape. So far, his findings are not fabulous. They're not like, oh, equal 1-to-1, you know, if you have enough beavers on the landscape. But our landscape is so dramatically degraded that I tend to question, like, I want to see that study built on to see whether, as we improve the landscape, using beaver intrinsic potential, which I'm about to talk about, could it be, it's obviously better than losing all our snowpack and heck, just going straight down the mountainside. But how close could it get to snowpack being held there? We don't have a choice, you know, of holding the snowpack or not. I'd say it's a pretty good alternative to get as many beaver up there as possible. But we're going to talk about some of the challenges of getting the beaver up there and keeping them up there. So one of the ways we're looking at how do we put beaver on the landscape is through modeling. And Ben Didbrenner just finished up his PhD at UW, and he's creating the beaver intrinsic potential model, which is really looking at physical features on the landscape of, do they accommodate the gradient, the valley width, are those accommodating beaver, are potentially accommodating beaver. There's also the BRAT model. I will just say one more thing. Ben is about to finish up Washington's entire BIP analysis, and he is including veg layers as well as land ownership and conflict potential in that analysis, and that's going to be available through WDFW anytime now. Right now, he's ground truthing some places still to make sure it's as accurate as it can be. There's also the BRAT model, which has been amazing. It's a little more, it's still got physical characteristics, but it's based a little more on vegetation, presence, current presence, and historical, and what it could be again. Maybe at the end, Cody could speak a little bit more to that. I think he's used BRAT a lot more than I have. But another incredible tool to put in your basket to assess these incised channels, these degraded channels, to see where would be the best effort, best bang for your buck on that one. We do a site assessment at every site we consider for putting beaver back on the upper landscape. And I'm not sure how well you all can see this, but we look at many different aspects of the landscape, including how fast is the flow currently, how are there conflicts with landowners nearby, is there potential for roads and culverts and other structures to be an issue if they get plugged up? Is there active beaver activity 2,000 feet up or downstream already, because they are territorial and they can run each other out of areas, but that's also a good thing, because then they spread their benefit potentially across the landscape that way. But we want to, and are now required to by WDFW, to not put beaver into places where they exist already. That's not been a big problem so far. We also are looking at gradient, depth of streams, which is a really critical part for beavers to avoid predation, as well as the area of streams. Dominant substrate, what kind of food is available, another critical part. How close or distant is it from the stream? Beaver are great athletic swimmers, but on land they're just little walking jerky pockets. You know, they are easy targets for predators on land. So if they don't have a deep pool and a wide enough pool, they're going to have a hard time escaping predation. And right now they're outnumbered on our landscape as far as prey predators. As you all probably know, but almost anything will eat a beaver if it eats meat. So bears, cougars, bobcats, and wolves. Wolves love beavers. So floodplain width, lodge and dam materials available, and whether it's a historic site or not, that all goes into our assessment. Historic beaver use site, that if you have visibility of dams or old shoes or anything that might support them even more so. And then we add all those totals up, and we can just do it from a basic number saying, is it a good release site scoring between 45 and 90? Is it a poor release site scoring between 0 and 44? And of course you put your notes in there, and you have certain things that you might grade higher than others based on the context of that site. Yeah.
Quick question. I'm just noticing you have alder listed as a hardwood food. Have you observed them using alder?
Yes, a lot of times mostly taking it down and using it for dam material.
Construction, yeah.
Because some of our sites are dominated by alder.
Right.
And as soon as they start building, the inundation kills the alder anyways, but they're often cutting them down before they're killing them.
Yeah, because I've seen them use alder for construction, but only for food when they're really desperate.
And I can't speak too much about how successful they are with alder, but I know in some stream situations like Matt Young with the Colville, generally doing okay.
Because that's like our main tree at Triple Creek. We have tons of alder,
Yeah.
but
We have one site, Bear Creek, where it is primarily all alder, and there are willow moving in, but they just cut everything down alder, any alder, and the aspen are starting to regenerate from the fire, so they are having that sort of agricultural impact of opening up the canopy, having a lot more water. The aspen are regenerating beautifully because of fire and the water there. So yeah, I think they're gonna be in that site for a long while. That's one of our most successful sites, is in a burn system where the pressure was taken off the deciduous vegetation by removing the canopy of pine and alder with the fire and the aspen, but now the aspen are regenerating beautifully. That was a big part of my study, is looking at regeneration of those fire tolerant trees, deciduous trees in particular. And everywhere where beaver were in a burn, the veg composition looked more like where there was no burn with beaver than it did without. So that was really cool to see too, how rapidly, with especially that water table being brought up, that riparian veg just came back really fast. We kind of look at it as 1 meter of depth across a broader area. Thinking about, if a bear or a wolf jumps into the pool with them, are they going to be able to swim to safety? Are they going to be able to dig a burrow if there's not material to build a lodge right away? So we think about, like, how much time are we giving them when we put them in a site to protect themselves, to build any sort of infrastructure to protect themselves. If we drop them in a creek that's 3 meters wide and of half a meter deep, and there's only about this room would be a big room for them, as far as a pond, but say up here in the front area, they can't escape a predator that comes into that system. And as Alec likes to say, if you are spreading your scent with every waddle across the landscape, you're easy to find, especially a bear's nose is 6-7 times more capable of smelling things than ours. They can come miles smelling a beaver. So they're sitting ducks if they don't have cover, and water is the best cover for them.
Maybe you're gonna get this, Alexa, but you never built starter homes.
The Beaver Project did. That was a regular part of the beginning of relocating beaver onto the upper landscape, was building a little lodge for them. They never found that the beavers used it. And they had cameras on it, and they would check for the inside, any activity, and almost always they didn't use it. So they stopped spending the time, because it actually took a few hours to build something that you didn't think a bear could just rip apart with one swipe.
I'm thinking more PDAs to get those depth requirements.
Well, yes, we will get to that. Okay. That was not, typically, beavers were released into historic beaver ponds, beaver meadows, where there was ponding still, where there was some food, some depth of water, where they could easily start to improve the habitat, and just hadn't been able to access it because they were so high on the landscape for so long. So the whole idea was, let's take these nuisance beavers that are going to be killed if we don't do something with them, and put them up on the landscape that's owned by one landowner, usually, maybe two, if you have Forest Service, NWW, or DNR, and where they're not a problem, and see what they can do, and especially historic sites that might support them. That was the original idea of the Menlo Beaver Project. And it's not a new one. The beavers have been restored to the landscape multiple times, even in the Met House, in the 30s and the 70s. And it just always, someone gets interest, and then it loses funding, interest funding. So we're in another round of it, but I think we're at a point now with climate issues and overall degradation of landscape and population challenges that I don't think we have too many more chances at this. So I think we got to really get it right, and that might just take a lot of different tools all at once to get it right. I'm kind of jumping to the end of my talk. But was there another question? Okay. So predation pressure. We think that's a huge part of the challenges we're facing by putting beaver up on the landscape where they don't have connectivity or really prime habitat, especially protective cover, when we put them back up there. There's a lot of predators on the landscape. That's great. We have a really, even becoming more so, intact landscape. We just went to a grizzly bear meeting last night in Winthrop, which was really cool to see after the Okanagan meeting just last week. Very different situations there. But The deeper the pool, the better. The larger the pool, the better. And DDAs are an essential part of creating that into the future. So we'll get to that. Kristen, we were totally thinking of you as we launched into this next section because we are having challenges with coexistence, not only with landowners, private landowners, but also restoration projects. And it's totally understandable. Beaver in simplified systems can make it challenging for other species, especially fish species, to exist in those simple single-channel systems. It's a challenge. Are they welcome? Not always. You know, they're not always welcome there, but we're trying to figure out ways to make them more welcome and to coexist with the endangered species, salmon particularly, that we have. So basically, we're looking at how do we design complexity at a deeper level into a lot of the restoration that's happening before it happens or adaptively afterwards. That's a big lift. You know, we're already challenged to get money to do restoration on these larger scales. This is a side channel of the Methow called Silver Side Channel. It's a historic town, the town of Silver between Detroit and Carlton. And a lot of money and effort has gone into restoring this area to accommodate spawning fish as well as a diverse riparian canopy. And beavers have kind of put it back to the way it was before the restoration started. It was just, you know, big backwater. So it's a challenge. We're trying to figure out how do we make that area more complex or at least ensure fish passage over it because it doesn't always get impacted by high flows and get fish washing over the top. There's not a big scour pool, as you can see here, for fish to jump it. There are some little wiggle room around right here. It's hard to see, but you know, only at higher flows are some of those spawners at least accessing that potentially. So we've got questions, and we need to figure out how to answer them. We have some ideas. Other folks have made more headway on some of these ideas, but one of our pushes is to look at funding to support coexistence rather than just relocation. So we want to collaborate as much as possible, fill the gaps in knowledge on both sides, you know, beaver restoration, fish restoration, riparian, veg restoration. They can all go together. Ideally, eventually, they did at one time, but we're just not in the complex systems that we used to have anymore. So we have to find solutions where they're not working together, and we can. We're really smart. Look at what we've done. One of those understandings is like figuring out whether spawning habitat is limited or rearing habitat is limited, and you can like bounce back and forth between those different priorities at different sites and try to adaptively manage for those different priorities. So that was a really exciting new thing I learned straight from Amanda. So the other part is the rest of the private landowners who just want their aspen trees or don't want their roads flooded, or even our parks where there's a culvert that gets blocked and it blocks trail access. So there's a lot of issues that can be addressed. We already have the knowledge, pond levelers, tree wrapping, tree painting, culvert protectors. These things have been in use for over a decade. Some people have probably been using them for a century that have created them on their own. But there's a lot more movement to make these happen. And that is one area that the Beaver Project really wants to expand upon. We don't do a lot of coexistence except removal. And we've been really good at it, at removal and relocation. But right now we have funding that's supporting us putting beavers back into the anadromous zone to help make habitat more complex for fish, to offer them different temperature regimes, to offer them different types of substrate regimes and habitat and cover. Yet we don't have funding to do anything but relocate from the anadromous zone if beavers are a problem. So that's one area where the Beaver Project is really looking to expand our services to our community and to others as training and otherwise. So we've got a lot of those plans in the upcoming winter and next season. River beavers. A lot of people think about river beavers as being the source for taking beaver and putting them out on the landscape. But our river beavers are actually our reproductive pool of beavers. So we have to at least be thinking about it, being thoughtful about how many beavers we're taking out of the system. We're we're calling them nuisance beavers because people don't want them cutting down their aspens. But if we're offering services to help people live with their beavers and not let them cut down every aspen at least, then we could be maintaining that population in the river more than we are now. Other places might not have an issue with this. The west side, this may not be an issue. But we are finding on the east side, at least in the Methow, that we're not sure where our beaver population truly stands. There has not been a beaver population study in the Methow, in the Pacific Northwest, in the Western region, in North America, ever. It is all based on trapping records. Simon's publications, they're quoted all the time, or cited all the time, there were once, 60 to 400 million beaver. There are now estimated 15 million beaver. That's all just like conjecture. There is no study that has done it. They're difficult to study, especially in our mountainous system. You can walk right by a beaver site that's small, and unless you have a good nose like Alec, our trapper, you have no idea that they're even there. So we're looking at partnering with folks to do a much more intense beaver density study in the Methow and try to extrapolate that out onto the landscape. We're looking at using tail tags, which are not great. At least down in Oregon, they haven't proven to be really successful. They come off, rip out of beaver tails. So we want to combine at least that until our company can support like more robust, smaller units for tracking. We also want to look at eDNA and how are we put this pilot study together. How do we track whether beaver are even in the system and how long after they're in the system can we still detect them? How far downstream from them, where we know they are, which in the Methow Beaver Project, we know where beaver are generally in the valley, so we can at least test how effective it is. So this is an area that we're going to start working with Karen Goldberg at WSU. If anyone else wants to jump on board with that, we would love multiple watersheds to be looking at the same time, if that's possible. WDFW has some trans centers that they are wanting relocators to start working with. So it's an upcoming thing that if you're interested, Beaver Working Group is going to start addressing that and moving forward with how do we know what our, especially east side beaver populations, where they're at, what's their status. Okay, so our successes, we have relocated over 400 nuisance beavers over the last 11 years. Yeah, and this is our hatchery. If some of you aren't familiar with how we do this now, we do try to collect entire families of beaver from a nuisance site. And until we collect all the family, we bring them to the Winthrop National Fish Hatchery, which we've had a great relationship with for 10 years. They allow us to use defunct rearing channels at the hatcheries for beavers, and it's been very, very helpful. So with the help of professor at Central Washington University, we mastered how to sex beavers because, as most of you know, you cannot tell from the outside what sex they are, and if we didn't capture families that a single beaver, we'd want to release them with ideally opposite sex beaver out onto the landscape, so they might not leave an area to go looking for a beaver. They have a starter kit. Yeah, we put you in a nice pond, we give you a mate, and hopefully you'll do your thing, and we'll have more beavers and expanding out from there. So in order to do that, you have to sex them to be able to pair them and then put them out on the landscape together. So the Beaver Project has really brought a lot of these techniques together, husbandry, that have been more effective than just hard releases. Picking up a beaver from one site, taking them to another site, dropping them off. They always leave. Always. McKinstry in Wyoming can attest to that. So we've relocated over 400 onto 60 different sites over the years. These are the sites within the Methow watershed. There's Lake Chelan right here for reference. And this last year we had 24 hydrologically significant sites. That basically means that dams are holding water. That's what we call hydrologically significant. They're not always being actively maintained, but in a lot of these places, especially in a series of low water years, they can last 1 season, 5 seasons, maybe even more, depending on the flows. Here is some hydrologically significant ponding. This is Hooker Creek, and we're starting to get into a lot more drone imagery and ortho imagery to look at changes in the sites that we're working in, which is really fun and exciting. So I'm just going to blaze through a few of our successes.
Alexa, what does that mean, hydrologically significant?
It's holding water. So there are beaver-built dams that are creating a pond that is broader than the channel that exists there without the pond. Okay. So basically, it doesn't have to be being maintained by a beaver for us to call it hydrologically significant. So until that dam breaches and it goes back to being a single channel, and then we call it hydrologically significant. That's kind of our success standard. Okay. So it changes every year. That's why we go and do assessments after dropping them off and seeing if they're still there, if it's still holding, are we still getting the benefits of beaver even without beaver currently at the site. Because we're finding that they leave or they don't persist. Even if they stay, they're not able to persist on that upper landscape for very long at most of our sites. Some of the sites they are, and there are some factors there that we're still trying to work out, but springs have a lot to do with it, and the food source has a lot to do with it so far that we're finding. This is Black Canyon, one near that spot that I showed you at the beginning, that beautiful green terrace beaver complex. This is right near there, and beavers survived the fire. If any of you have seen Beaver Believers by Sarah Koenigsberg, she featured Medho Beaver Project work a lot. She was out here right after the fire with Kent Woodruff, and the beavers made it through the fire, the Carlson complex, and yeah, and they started rebuilding. They didn't just leave. It was pretty amazing. There's hardly any food there, but one side of the complex burned and the other one didn't. So we now have a graduate student at Eastern looking at resistance of beaver systems and complexes to resist fire. And even something as small as this stops the fire at the beaver pond. Wow. Pretty cool. This is a gorgeous spot from the 2006 tripod fire, way up high. Beavers have persisted there for going on 10 years now. So that's one of the anomalies too. This is one of our highest sites. There's no connectivity to other beavers, miles to go before you connect to another beaver. But they're here, and they've been persisting. So they're probably pretty inbred at this point. I don't know how long they'll last, but this is some work done by another master's student, Izzy Tween, and Catherine Means, two students, where they were looking at pond widths and depths across different established sites. And so I'll just point out a few little things. These are just different creeks and their cross sections. Up here in the, I think purple is downstream of the beaver dam and pond. The green is right below the dam, and then blue is upstream. You can't see it in this one. Oh, actually, you know what? I'm sorry I put all these on here. I didn't realize this one was a different legend. But basically, the widest one, as you can probably imagine, is the pond cross-section. And you have depths of 1 meter. Generally, that's kind of where we get that 1 meter safety zone from, is what we see out there where they are successful. And then their width, you know, going on 40 meters or more. And some places as low as 8 meters, 10 meters. So they vary a ton. So your cross-section with the beaver pond is really wide. Without the beaver pond, upstream and down, you have this really narrow incised channel at almost every site that we have. So, to give you an example of what beavers are doing out there. And part of our successes is education. You know, Kent Woodruff has been an amazing poster child, is the only thing I can think of in my head, ambassador for beavers across the West and even across Canada. He actually helped create another film called One Stick at a Time that was really focused on climate change and climate resilience issues. And he brought it all over the West in Canada to show to different communities and helping people understand why beavers are important on the landscape. They've been such a part of, you know, fur bears as a form of income or as a nuisance. And he really has helped open people's eyes and minds to beavers being a partner on the landscape and an original shaper of the landscape and how we could really benefit from them being back on the landscape, but they need help. And then Eager, if you haven't read it, oh my gosh, it's a page turner, and you don't have to know a ton about beaver, but it's got something for everyone. Even if you're a real techie, I was working on my master's when this came out, and I learned so much from this book. And that's one of the things I love about it, is that Ben Goldfarb has connected the beaver communities from North America, but across the pond too, in Europe, where they're doing reintroducing castor fiber, and there's actually some Castor canadensis over there. There's 2 species of beaver left on the planet, and those are the 2. The one you saw in that picture before, the statue of the big beaver, that was actually a model of Castorides, a predecessor of our current common Castor canadensis and Castor fiber. So they were gigantic, paleo beaver. So cool. But their brains are the same size. Paleo beaver, Castor canadensis, brain cavity, same size. So, wow. And in Beaver Believers, if you haven't seen this film, Sarah Koenigsberg is winning award after award, just won the Green Spark Award, which is an international award for sparking environmental awareness across the globe. Her filmism is excellent. And now her next project, do you want to ask?
No, finish your sentence.
Her next project is focusing on fire. And so beavers, she's like, I'm not ready to be done with beavers, but I'm going to go on this bigger picture, and beavers will play this little part in it. And so we're courting Hillary Franz, who's being the leader of the DNR at this point, as Lands Commissioner, as to all the waves she's been making around supporting prescribed fire and taking care of our forests on a much more intensive scale. And so hopefully look for that in a couple of years, hopefully not more than that. Look for another visiting film from her. Yes.
I just wanted to say, if you'd like to see Beaver Believers, we're going to be showing it in Chenasket on the first Friday of April at the Community Center as part of our education series, Island Wonders.
It's so good.
Yes. The Forest Service a willing partner in all this? Maybe I missed that.
Absolutely. John Rohr is the wildlife bio over at the Meadow Ranger District, and he's on our advisory board. So, and he has been from the beginning. The Meadow Beaver Project was his brainchild, and he roped Kent in, who was a Forest Service biologist for John, under John, and said, Kent, run with this, and Kent did. Yeah. So, and Kent's still involved as an advisor too, for sure. All right. So where are we going? We are focusing even more on community engagement and awareness. We want to make sure people understand that living with their beaver on their property is a much better prospect for the future than relocating them elsewhere. And we want to help them make those good decisions and make it possible for them to make those good decisions. This was our 10-year celebration event and our first celebration event ever. That just happened in September, and we did get Ben Goldfarb and Sarah Koenigsberg there, showed the film. We had over 300 people attend, which was so fantastic. We had very cool shirts made, as our young biologist Isla Newman here is sporting and helping raise awareness of beavers by having people get those beautiful pelts. I'd like to keep on the beaver rather than off. Where are we going? I said it a few times. We're trying to move towards supporting coexistence for landowners. Wrapping trees, painting trees with sand paint, putting culvert protectors in, pond levelers, fish, I always say that wrong, fish passage pond levelers as well, where they are needed. We don't want to put more culverts in our streams, but when we don't have choices, when we've made a lot of poor choices in the last 200 years of how we're treating our landscape, sometimes we have to take some paths that we wouldn't necessarily want to take in order to get to a place we want to go. And in the meantime, we learn a ton more about it. So a fish passage pond leveler is basically a pond leveler, a pipe through, it's my last slide, I'm sorry. A pond going through a pipe going through a beaver dam from the pond to below the dam downstream. And it basically keeps the pond at a certain elevation, water elevation level. And that can prevent roads from flooding, it can prevent a house from flooding, it can prevent plants from being inundated that you don't want to be inundated. That can solve a lot of problems, but it doesn't always solve fish passage issues. And so Mike Callahan has spearheaded how you make fish passage possible through these culverts at the same time, and it's working. Seattle City Lights had one in action for 5+ years now, over on their power line ponds just past New Salem. So those are working for chum. There's other places where they've been using them on the west side, and then on the east coast they're starting to use them for Atlantic salmon. So this is an area that's unsightly. I will be the first to admit it doesn't look pretty, but if we can capture the benefits of beaver and have this unsightly structure for a little while until we figure out a better way to add complexity to the system. Even with all the development and roads and, you know, other things, I'd say it's a good way for us to move to ensure we have the best of both worlds. But I'm so totally open to ideas and suggestions of how we do this. Digging scour pools where there aren't scour pools, digging a side channel where there isn't one, doing more adaptive management and maintenance that we often aren't funded to do, but we need to start try to work into our funding plans to be able to address that, because this is a long-term adaptive management process restoration in general. So living with fish is a huge part of what we want to do at the Met Howe Beaver Project, and ensure beaver have a place in the Madrona zone, and make sure they're benefiting the fish as much as possible. This, of course, is a culvert protector that is working in this system, even though it's high flows. It's still working here. It's not dammed up. And we're also jump-starting restoration. Oh, this is a fun part. I hope I have enough time. Go for it. Okay. Jump-starting restoration in the inside streams, where beaver can't just be dropped in and expected to make any dramatic improvements, which is most of the inside spurned areas, although they have their ways, especially with our springs and little low gradient pockets where beaver can divert water from the main inside streams. They are having success. But where they aren't, that's where we can come into. This is a project we worked on this summer in a historic beaver meadow way up high. There's a series of 7 beaver dams, a huge meadow complex, almost at alpine level. And they haven't been there for decades. The cows are in here all the time. The dams are breached, long ago breached, but still intact for the most part. And here we came in, Alex spotted this doing some mapping and modeling. And he came up, checked it out, and was like, there's potential here for us to just block up these holes with BDAs and stop the water. So we did. We got a crew out there. We blocked up 4 holes in the 7 different dams. Some of them didn't make sense. They had already filled in previously, and even though they were leaking water, there wasn't really an opportunity to build a BDA. So you're just using your best approach to each of these systems. But we put in 4 BDAs, and this is a long time frame. I'll go to a shorter one, but from August 22nd, when we put them in, I want you to note this structure circled here is the same structure circled here. So in October, we got a snow and a freeze right away, and that just happened to be right when I went up there. But this is all holding water, and it was not holding water at all. This summer, there was just a narrow inside channel going right through this spot here. This is our staging area. We took all local materials, cut down conifers. We're trying to open up the canopy even more, so we're taking local materials. We used conifer boughs because that's all we had in there. And you see a little bit of deciduous sedge, but not much. And a lot of sediment. That was one area that we figured, like, we need to really stop this up so it will hold water. And there's not a whole lot of sediment moving through that system. There aren't high flows in there. It's really high up there, and it's a big meadow. So we really took the time to stomp sediment in, layer it with our weeds, and it was incredibly effective. As you can see in another site, so that's the same spot from the other angle, same dam. This is one that we put the dam in, came back the next day, and can't see real well, but there's a little bit of water here now after damming this up. This was a month later. You can see, look at the grass level, and here's the top of the grass here. These are the reference points that sound. And then in October, the grass is completely underwater here now. So we're holding a lot of water in these 4 dams that now meadows that we repaired. So that was really exciting. And another area we're working into, this is private land down lower. This is a tributary of the Met Howe River itself. Really, private land only about 2 miles from the main stem. And they experienced the 2014 fires, Carlson Complex, and all of their riparian cottonwoods channel inside. Riparian cottonwoods fell after burning and spanned over top of the channel, the deeply inside channel. There's like very little wood getting into the channel to offer any benefit of woody structure and flowing sediment. and starting to aggrade sediment again. So what we did was come in with a former smoke jumper, JT Sawyer, so rad, skilled with a saw, and our crew just pulled and cut long wood, long dimension wood. We kept it as long as we could to get it in there, used chainsaw come-alongs and brood strength to get it all in the channel and start adding complexity and grading hopefully this next spring with the freshet. So that's an 800-foot length of privately owned stream, you know, that nobody accesses that, but it's dumping a ton of sediment into the Met House. And there's several other challenges downstream and upstream, but this is kind of our pilot study of there's a ton of wood here. It's not in the channel. Let's get it in the channel and see what it can do. And it took a while to get the landowner buy-in. It took 2 years to get it, but we did. And just downstream of here, we did plantings and put in some bank anchored structures, not channel spanning structures, to try to make sure that none of this moved any further past. We put plugs of wood in at a pinch point, just kind of like that control point of stage 0. And can't wait till spring to see what happens.
Shout out to Matt Young.
Absolutely, thank you. Matt Young was an incredibly important partner on this project as well. So it was Beaver Project, Met House Salmon Recovery Foundation, and the Colville Tribe. And yeah, they did an awesome job, and they're always so energetic and gung-ho about these projects. So this is what we're going for in general, like many of you, is adding structure and complexity to eventually add beaver into a system where beaver can maintain it. Because this is not the place to drop beaver in usually. This looks nicer than a lot of our systems are, but we're finding that, you know, it's just too high of flow, too high discharge for beaver to really be successful in here. But if we can add the structure and then add the beaver, there's going to be a lot greater success rate. And then your water table just comes back gangbusters at that point and supports a lot more acreage for the little work that you did, and beavers are the best at maintaining them. So what we've learned is that beavers are not a highly reliable form of habitat restoration on their own, but if we can support them by helping prep habitat as far as channel incision and food and make sure it's a good spot by assessing those sites well, they do an excellent job at enhancing these restoration sites and maintaining them over time. Coexistence is key for us as practitioners, as landowners, as with fish, with all species. We want to focus on collaboration and coexistence. We want to try to make people more aware of our population of beavers and where they're at. That this is our reproductive pool of having river beavers. Because beavers, as everyone who's done the stage 0 so far, beavers move in once you repair the system. But if there aren't beavers there to move in, then you don't have them coming and maintaining it and helping maintain them. And I don't feel like we're at a super risky point now, but I don't want to get there either. So I'm not saying our beavers are desperately, you know, should put on the ESA or something, but I want us to be thoughtful about how we are managing them, how we're using them as a tool for restoration, because they're also a really critical species in the river too, and especially as a reproductive pool. And we're focused on that need to prepare degraded habitat enough for beaver to be in there. So a little repetitive, but BDAs are critical for making beaver successful in our very impacted landscape. And climate resilience, that's the most critical thing. It's why we're doing this in general, for biodiversity and resilience, as we have an unknown future ahead of us as humans, but as just another organism on this planet. So yeah, these are all of our partners and sponsors. Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, Bureau of Reclamation, Pacific Biodiversity Institute from a long time ago, Yakima, Colville, Menlo Conservancy, the Watershed Council, WDFW, huge one. We've had so many partners, and we're so grateful for that, and we're always looking for more. There's never enough. So thank you.
All right, anyone have any questions for Alexa? I guess I have one. After sitting through this week's training and hearing more about different approaches, would you consider doing sort of the grade line stage zero approach before putting in beavers, or Johanna, have you ever been working in an area where there were beavers and someone came in and
Yeah,
you're
we were
working
talking
in
with Alexa yesterday, a lot of times in our West Cascade Stream, this is just one part of Oregon that we're working on stage zero. Beaver are there, they're just not thriving, they just kind of are existing and trying to hang on, and then we changed the energy dynamics, and literally overnight, like during the project, we'll come out there the next day, and there'll be beaver sticks everywhere, and we're completely exposed to water dip. So, blast, are you doing VDAs? Not really, we're just kind of redoing the energy so that they just thrive. They have so every one of these projects where beaver are present, they just take off.
And we are finding that in the river, they hone in on the restoration sites really fast because all of a sudden there's really good habitat for them. What's good for fish works really well for beaver too. So it's a challenge, but it's also saying we're moving in the right direction. Because people will say, I see beaver in the river all the time. But they are moving around. They're transient. There's not great habitat. The Methow River's inside 6 feet. You know, there's bank beavers in some places, but a lot of the time they're just looking for their next site unless they find a side channel that's been restored, and all of a sudden the water's slower and it's starting to connect with that side channel floodplain a little bit more, and the food's coming back, and there you're going to find beaver. So that's why we're kind of concerned, starting to be more thoughtful about the population and the nuisance beaver situation. We've gotten so many fewer nuisance calls over the last 3 years than we did in the previous 7. So they're reducing. So we just want to make sure we aren't setting ourselves up for disaster another 10 years down the line after we've moved another 400 beavers up into the upper landscape where they're not persisting very well because of the challenges that I described earlier of connectivity, of lack of good habitat up there, and predation. So, yeah. I do want to say some of the challenges around relocating that our trapper Alex might be able to address even more so is WDFW has now new regulations on relocating beaver. It used to be the research permit was required to move them. Now you can apply to be a relocator as long as you're meeting certain criteria. But it's also more difficult to work with private landowners. It's very difficult to release on private land. As our private organization, we hold all the risk that if beaver go and do something that we don't want them to do, that we are held liable for that. The agencies don't necessarily have that as covered under your agency umbrella, but we're not under that. And so our organization is all of a sudden at greater risk for doing relocation. So it's something that's evolving and mostly in a good way, but as all regulations can be, it can be a little challenging. Alex, you want to speak to that?
I'll just add to that, just by Jason's question about, like, do we have a good working relationship with the board? That's kind of our primary partner where we are. We're severely limited with planning projects, and especially planning pricing. The state issued the statewide relocation permit this year, and so, Cody has one, I have one, it's a permit that are usually assigned to our name. So our project hit tag beavers, so they are identified damage, fish rays or a hand scanner, and so every beaver I release hides my name. When you do a fish restoration project or any sort of stream restoration project, standard protocol to Methow Stream Recovery Foundation, they get adjacent landowners to sign off and say, hey, conditions might change, and we want you to be okay with that. With beavers, they're live individuals, and there's nothing to stop them
So,
Do that.
so we do
Grant
as well, but
you do
yeah, we do, yeah. But that's not a requirement of the WDFW. In fact, identification is, in any way, it's not a requirement of the WDFW process, right? Neither is like holding them, acclimating and all that. You could just do hard release as long as you have a facility available to some concern over, I don't know, injury or something like that, right? So that is a programmatic choice. But we're also making that decision, so I share your.
Right.
Yeah.
It's really a conscious decision on how we monitor our programs and our and understanding how beaver move and trying to figure out why they don't like a place when they don't like it, which is a lot of the time where we put them. So, yeah.
So for folks who are new to beaver relocation, is not new for you, but the WDFW permit for relocation is brand new this year. This is essentially the pilot year. And before that, we had a law on the books about not moving beavers from the west side of Cascade east and vice versa, and that was really big. Our agency doesn't count beaver, we don't have any population studies going on. So this is an evolving thing, and I would just say, like, for those that are closely involved with it, Stephanie, Melinda, that's coordinating this, give her feedback, because like our district wildlife biologist was brand new to this, and she was kind of, like caught off guard because somebody else had been participating from Wenatchee in it, and it was just like, oh, I want to like make sure like this is addressing all these different concerns, and I think it's been managed so loosely before, and now they've really tightened down, and it's hopefully we'll find a happy medium with feedback from project sponsors into how this can better work, and in terms of like liability concerns. I think anyone working in restoration, there's always this risk, and trying to balance the risk and property. And so that's not necessarily anything like anyone working with engineered plot stands, like high amount of risk and high amount of liability that person is drawing. So, it's kind of finding a balance like people have for other types of high risk restoration projects, but also kind of, maybe working with the landowners to talk about what their comfort level risk is in getting something in writing, because beavers can disperse in a huge range. So, if the beaver goes off somebody's property, they could also go from public land onto private land, and that's not something anyone can control. So it might be worth like working with Stephanie to maybe look for more options, and because maybe there's other property ownership that should be explored other than the forest service in the future.
Stephanie has been great, and Sarah Kinshu, everyone at WWW has been great to work with, and the Beaver Working Group. That was a 2-year process to really come up with the pilot study and make this all happen, and there was a lot of participation. I just came in at the tail end of it, but our first training that just happened in August went off really well, and I think we're going to build from there and try to cover as many of the challenges that do exist with it, but also I think everybody's pretty happy with how it has all unfolded. So, yeah.
Any other questions for Alexa, and then we'll switch to more general questions as we wrap up. On the phone, did anyone have questions for Alexa or Julie, since I skipped over that?
This is Chris. I have one for Julie, and this harkens back to one of our first slides showing the historical condition of her stream reach. I think it was taken by Rick and Jerry Gillespie back in 1997, and it showed like the reach that she was working in or has worked in was really well connected to the floodplain. And then 15, 18 years later, whatever, it's extremely incised stream reach now. Is she aware of any of the land use activities that might have resulted in that condition?
Can I answer from here?
Yes, there's a tool
Okay.
right there.
Thanks for your question. Yeah, someone else had asked also about the cause of the incision, and so we don't know for sure to what degree each factor played a role, but there were multiple land use issues that most likely contributed to the incision. And we know that one of the largest beaver dams was breached just prior to a rain on snow event. And so the 1-2 punch with those two changes was probably significant, but there was also a fairly long history of overgrazing in the watershed, removal of woody vegetation near the stream throughout the reach and both upstream and downstream of it, as well as some aggressive logging in the upper watershed. So there were many, there are multiple land use practices that probably contributed to the incision.
Thank you.
Perfect.
Do you know if those practices have been curtailed or completely removed, like grazing, for example?
So that is going to be an ongoing long-term journey. We still have cattle grazing in the stream in various parts of the watershed nearby. And there are some places where they've been excluded, like the other project that we did in 2014, 2 river miles downstream, is a mitigation site for the Buckhorn gold mine, and part of the agreement is that cattle will be excluded from that wetland in perpetuity, and there's a conservation easement on that property. So there's been some progress, but overall, we still have a long ways to go in terms of land management in the watershed. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
You bet. And who was asking?
This is Chris Fisher.
Ah, hey, Chris. Thanks for your
Hi.
questions.
You bet.
Any other questions on the phone or in the room?
Julie, wasn't part of the watershed burned also?
The Myers Creek watershed?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would have to look into that and get back to you. I'm sure. I mean, there's been fire throughout history. Okay. That would be worth looking into also.
Well, I want to thank our presenters today. Okay, thank you guys so much. The last thing I want to do is just open it up to anybody that wants to share any observations, and then also if anyone has any follow-up sort of topics of conversation, I'd love to capture those. Like I said, there'll be a follow-up meeting in December to kind of build on some of what we've talked about today and maybe capture some ideas for analysis that we need or future discussions or bringing in specific parameters that folks think we need to have a discussion with to gain some more understanding. Or sharing just, if you have a project and it seems like you could make it a stage 0, if you need more collaboration with some of the folks today on what to do or how to do it, or just creating sort of a general group of us that are knowledgeable and may be able to tap into that new resource in the region. So just want to throw that out there. Does anyone have any observations or thoughts? Or we have about, I'll give it 10 minutes, see how much time we want to spend on this, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. Yeah. My primary thought is thank you for bringing all of us together and sharing the tools and building content, the different ways that apply to different contexts. That's a huge gift, really, that's necessary for you to educate.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other thoughts or topics? I definitely jotted something down for the IT meeting. Yeah.
Just for selfish reasons, that I think it would be cool to do an actual design class, maybe where we all bring our laptops and have all the tools and our, relative projects and just go through the motions of doing the elevation.
Yeah.
If that's possible, and
Yeah.
Yeah, last year at River Restoration Northwest, we actually had a workshop where we did that, about 70 people, and successful outcomes.
yeah,
Went
that's
through,
the format,
actually went through the model that Paul was giving you an example of the screen.
Yeah, we'll work on that. This is a great follow-up. Any other? Yep.
it seems like the stuff that
comment from Erin about just, so first of all, just for on the phone, we had a suggestion of a design class to run through how to create the REMs, and then another suggestion to have further dialogue about permitting. I think those are great. And Jason, do you want to keep going?
Isn't GSRO, to build on Erin's comment, isn't GSRO getting feedback on permitting difficulties in Washington, and maybe if you would need to bring that back? And I think it's a two-way street in terms of education.
Yeah. And Andrea was on the phone, and we had the services here. And yeah, so and we've had DFW. So if we have specific permitting challenges we know are at play, we can focus on those. Obviously, it depends on the project. And I heard from most of them saying start early and kind of build that trust. And I also think that, you know, Oregon spent a long time building that trust with their permitters. And so I also have heard that, and just reflecting that lesson learned, that we may need to start on a few of these and build a little trust and see how they work. And then that may kind of create some continued sort of building on itself, so we can move through easier in the future, but it may be a little slow in the beginning.
Greer?
Right, that we can build that trust over time, and we're not there yet. A couple of our permitters seem to really get it now and are agreeable. We're still like working with Division of State Lands in Oregon. They're very skeptical about State Zero. They don't want to put it into programmatic committee that Bill talked about. But the other two that Bill presented on our committee in consultation, he's the kind of liaison with these agencies for us at our regional level. It's also your guys' liaison too. So he kind of offered, hey, you know, I'm not doing a lot of work with people in Washington, but in the future, establish a connection with Bill and say, how can we get these together and talk about what's going on in Oregon, or, you know, whatever would help. So really good one. Part of making really good people. But just like you said, Greg, it's all about relationships. So on that huge Southport project, Kate did all the permitting for that. It was just, you know, they tell us at least a year in advance we want to see the 404 permit submitted. So we had almost, I can think of 3 projects where we were waiting on the final permit to come to us in the mail before we could start. Like, machines were ready to go. So we've had issues where it's taken time, a lot of time to get these permits out, but it's been better. We're getting more relationships. They're not as squeamish about some of the services which could do with
Another approach that seen on other projects here is if there's a similar project that's been done elsewhere in the state, like different forests within the state, it's like, oh, hey, out on the coast, they cite this technique and it's successful, you know, like Cindy's recommended, like, this is her background in the forest, or she's like, oh, I know about, you know, this person, and you can talk to them, you know, in terms of concerns from the permitting aspect. So maybe it's also, you know, the counterparts in Oregon, the counterparts in Washington, you know, linking them up, because, you know, we are conservative from a regulatory perspective, because if we, you know, if we miss something, then it, you know, it can come back on us. We're not upholding, you know, our respective jurisdictions. So it's on, you know, trying to ask the right questions of the applicants to make sure we're you know, the map is being shown essentially, that all the risk is being accounted for, and that, you know, we're going to have a list when it's all said and done. So, but maybe agencies, you know, in terms of permitting might be helpful too, if you have some of those who have come around and seen the great code.
One other quick thing, probably is, when I was more of a field going person doing restoration on the ground, I can think of a better restoration project where I just fill all the paperwork in and I send it in and then come back. On the next one, I took folks out there a year in advance and walked the whole site, talked about what we're gonna do. Oh my gosh, that permitting went so well because they understood what we were doing. Some of the State Zero stuff, people just don't understand what we're talking about doing. So take them to the site, walk them through, talk about what you're going to do, get their buy-in on the ground a year in advance, and your permitting will go a lot better.
Chris, did you have just to summarize some of that conversation, because I know you probably missed it on the phone, but Amanda had a good idea of connecting Washington with her Oregon counterparts so they can kind of figure out how this works in a permitting sort of environment. And Johan mentioned that Bill would be a good person to connect to because he represents us as well as Oregon out of the regional office for Forest Service. Chris, did you have a comment? I think that was you.
It was me. Thanks, Greer. You know, the last couple of days, whether it was stage 0 restoration or what the presenters exhibited today or displayed today was, you know, a key element in all of this is wood. And it just so happens the last, 5 years, 2015 and 2018, we had fires throughout this area. And it just seems like we have an inordinate or an abundance of material to do this type of work. Yet yesterday at the field trip, during the field trip, Gene Schultz seems like it was challenging or difficult to get that material, and at least and it included expensive too. And it just seems like we should look in to see if we can make that more streamlined and less expensive. I mean, I'm looking out my office window right now and just seeing a lot of fire burnt trees just, you know, potentially could be utilized for this kind of restoration work. It just seems like there's opportunity here. We have the material. Let's try to utilize it where we can, and it shouldn't be as onerous as it seems like it is.
Yeah, really good point. I'll mark that down as a topic to follow up with the Okanagan and Wenatchee and potentially the regional office. Yeah.
And DNR as well.
Oh, and DNR. Yep. Thanks, Chris. Go ahead, Erin.
Aquatic restoration, right there, it's so beautiful. But then you just have to think about NEPA for fuel production work, and that's a whole different NEPA than what you have to do for your aquatic. And it's a little intimidating to take on, and it could also delay your project a lot, your aquatic portion of your project. And that's just something I've thought about in East Park, where it would be a perfect thing to do. But it's like, how do you even initiate that field reduction component NEPA with the Forest Service? And if that can take more expensive, that can be, and it seems like such a perfect idea, and I want it to work. That's like thinking about actually undertaking it in and like extend that time frame.
Yeah, Erin was just commenting on the challenges associated with doing a fuels reduction to get the wood source, and the potential impacts to your timeline and budget. It might be worth, since we have a new forest supervisor, you know, having that conversation. I feel like I've been here 8 years and I've had this conversation with the forest, and we haven't had sort of a single person to go to really. So it would be worth having that dialogue about, we need wood for in-stream restoration. Let's try to figure out, and the collaborative might be other good place to go actually to facilitate this conversation. So I'll definitely mark that down and either go through the collaborative or through our partners with the Forest Service that have participated today. Amanda, do you have a point?
Yeah, can somebody in the collaborative kind of take point on the fuel production and sourcing wood, and then, you know, folks who primarily work in the aquatic restoration world, you know, focus on their part, and that way,
Yeah. Teaming up the fuel. Yeah.
And hopefully getting the timelines to match up, so one project isn't delayed because of another one.
Yeah. Is Mariah in here? Oh, she was in here. And that's a good example. They have a lot of fuels reduction already through NEPA. And so as they implement those fuels reduction projects, you know, I think in some cases, if it's smaller diameter trees, it's just a matter of getting it transported instead of burning it. It seems like, maybe I'm naive in that, but it may just be a fact of how you move the wood. And I know a lot of thinning projects are covered under CEs. Am I correct? Okay.
Yeah.
So there may just be a matter of.
That's not really, you know, a lot of that thinning stuff is not the wood you want to use.
No, that's true.
We talked,
You may not want to
Mary's
use.
husband and I were talking this morning. You know, if you're looking for a large number of trees with root lawns, and you're thinking, oh, we're going to go into the supplement vegetation stuff and start doing it, there's a whole, you start running into terrestrial problems, soil conditions, soil disturbance, all that kind of stuff. And it just makes it much more complicated if you're looking at a broader project, a bigger, broader project, not temporarily located right next to your site. If you can include it as part of the site, it's easier to make that argument. But, you know, there's all kinds of stuff. You know, post-Burns, I started back in the 90s, and post-Burns, we were like, oh, salvage logging, right? Well, the environmental community came unglued on that. And we, you know, look at the last time this forest had a salvage logging show after a fire, and how big was it? We tried one up on Tripod. You know, that was a 35,000 acre fire. It got whittled down to 3,000 acres or something like that. Took us a lot of time and money to do that analysis, and what was it for? What did it end up for? So I guess my thing, we all look and see all these trees and think, oh, wow, that'd be great to use. Well, there's more complexity than just, oh, let's just go grab that one. Yeah. It's much more complicated. So
it definitely needs its own agenda.
Yeah.
You need to identify what the challenges are, and that's how you get through them. I think there are some other forests that have streamlined this, and we could look to them to learn how they're doing it. I think it's an important factor in site selection too. If you know there's already land there. True. Yeah. Erin was just mentioning citing your project where there's already a thinning project might be worthwhile as well.
Colville National Forest managed to do that this year with upland thinning related to in-stream restoration on Sullivan Creek.
Oh, good.
So, good local Washington example of it actually working.
Okay. We're working on it right now with the Spruce River restoration. Oh, that's right. So I'm early phases, but trying to incorporate education projects into that while they're getting good.
Yeah, I was going to mention for the Eagle Creek project, we're sourcing wood from a private landowner who's doing private steward actually.
Yep.
So we weren't able to navigate it by utilizing public land, but it's still trying to get the core that utilizing private.
Good. Any other topics? I just jotted down LIDAR. So we have LIDAR, sounds like everywhere except for the ENIAT. So ENIAT LIDAR might be something we try to get to be able to do some of these models. Is it the one? No, okay. I know, I mean, the Methow and the Wenatchee were just flown in the last 3 years, so I was just assuming it was, yeah.
DNR has a plan that they're also cooperating with other agencies or other partners to get 1 meter, I think it's, what do they call it, the QL1 grade LIDAR, on all of the private and state lands within the state.
Yeah.
And they're working on that. They've got priorities set on the different areas of where they're collecting it. It's just a matter of obtaining funds to get it all done. But that does not include the federal land.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll have to check on that. I don't know.
I know Jason was working on some stuff to try to get stuff on some of the national forest, but I don't know. But in each one's, each one's different there, so.
We third board funded Wenatchee LIDAR, DNR Blue Forest Service and non-forest service, the non-wilderness areas in the Methow. There's a few holes. That was some fun, but yeah. So I guess just in general, identifying the holes in our LIDAR, especially if they're an area we're thinking of doing a project, how do we fill those gaps? And making sure we consolidate those efforts so when they go to do LIDAR, they're hitting all the areas we need at one time. So that would be it. That's my other. And then just, how do we cover design for this? It's great the State Bureau folks offered up themselves on Forest Service projects. And just, the more we can build a local design sort of expertise, whether it's within the Forest Service or not, I think that's another important sort of follow-up that I came away with, is having that local expertise would be super helpful.
Yeah, I think the one thing that's been running through my head, obviously, all week is just I would like to see more robust, risk analysis and assessment.
Okay.
Or a methodology to do it. Because that's, you know, with, at least in this watershed, we have, an awful lot of infrastructure, downstream infrastructure that's been wiped out in the past, you know, talked about in the 20s and 30s. And, you know, I'd hate to do anything. We've seen the potential for it recently, and I would hate to, it's just, it's always nagging me.
Is both your bureau risk assessment, do you think it could be modified to cover? No. Okay. Might be a starting point.
Well, yeah, you know, there's the bear risk assessment
Yeah,
too. That would be another similar starting point. But just, you know, how do you go about doing it? Do you use design flows or do you use design storms? You know, all that kind of stuff. What kind of factor of safety do you want to design for? You know, that, how do you basically cover yourself with all this, with all the risk assessment and give yourself some kind of assurance and confidence that, yeah, we're covered within any kind of reasonable event that may happen. Because we, you know, we can look at design flows all we want, and then you have a design storm come, and then, you know, Joe mentioned the dam breach hydrology. Well, it's a multiplier that is really hard to get a handle on, but is incredibly powerful and dangerous.
WDFW, Connie Eiten mentioned a risk assessment tool that they've been using. She's going to send it to me, but I haven't gotten it yet. Yeah, that'd be great.
From the restoration pathway.
I think so.
Yeah, so, yeah, there's safety checklist then.
That'd be for business.
I mean, the safety checklist is for projects occurring on our land, so it's not just looking at like the ecological benefits, it's looking at the, like factor of safety on, you know, impacts to recreational, so, you know, kind of multifaceted just as a landowner, and to make sure that we're not increasing liability risk on something on our property. So, yeah, I mean, it's kind of a general outline for these types of issues. So but it's for any work done by an outside group on our land.
We're talking about natural process, right? So at some level, we are going to have to decide that natural process inherently is a bit management risk, right? So I want to temper that conversation a little bit of that as well. Like, hopefully we can move in a direction where we don't try to control every last raindrop, every last particle of sediment around the land.
Wish you'd been here on Monday, Cody. You have to watch it, because that was a good takeaway. I think you reiterated some points the folks on the Forest Service said.
Are there any stage zero projects in Washington?
Colville has a small one.
Colville's have a small stage zero, yeah.
LeClaire Creek.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Maybe tour
Looks like LeClaire.
LeClaire Creek. There's a question about risk assessment to Bill. And
Up in Upper Yakima. Yeah.
That would be the trip up the Snoqualmie Pass, Aaron?
Yeah. I don't think that's the Stage Zero project. There's definitely restoration happening there. And I know, like, Paul Powers and the RAT team were out there taking a look at it recently. Not looking at, like, cut and fill.
any other comments from folks on the phone? Follow up.
No, thank you. It's been very valuable. I appreciate the opportunity to participate. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, well, thank you. I have a list of takeaways, more words, yeah. And I'll definitely follow up with emails. If you're going on the tour, just come up to the front and we'll do a little logistics. And for those that aren't, thank you so much for coming again. I really appreciate the dialogue. And go out there and get some projects going. That's the takeaway to me, is like, get our floodplains activated any way you can. So, thank you guys.
Thanks, Greer. Great.